Now, at 1 minute after 5, late news from the Wlw Communications Exchange. This is Pete Matthews. A shocked, unbelieving nation and the world are in mourning for President Kennedy. Here are the latest developments in the assassination of the president. The body of the slain chief executive is being moved early this morning to the White House, where it will lie in repose today. Late word from the White House says that the body of the president has arrived from Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. The body will lie in repose today at the White House. Last night, Dallas police formally charged 24-year-old Lee Oswald with the sniper slaying of the president of the Texas city at midday yesterday. Oswald was jailed without bond, insisting he didn't know what this is all about. Texas Governor John Connley, who was seriously wounded by one of the assassin's bullets, was reported in good condition last night following 4 hours of surgery. Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy has remained close by her husband ever since he was felled by the fatal shot. She was expected to go to the White House with the body this morning. Lyndon B. Johnson, the new chief executive, will meet with former President Dwight Eisenhower this morning at 11:30 and will head a group of high-ranking dignitaries in viewing Mr. Kennedy's body. The body of the slain president will lie in repose in the East Room of the White House today from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. For the first hour, only the immediate Kennedy family will be present. President Johnson and other officials will view the body between 11 and 2 o'clock. For the rest of the day, Associate Justices of the Supreme Court and members of the Federal Judiciary will view the body from 2 until 2:30. Members of the House and Senate and governors will attend from 2:30 till 5. From 5 to 6, members of the Diplomatic Corps will view the body. Tomorrow and Monday, the body will lie in state in the rotunda of the Capitol. The public will be able to file past the President's bier all day tomorrow, and from 9 until 10 a.m. on Monday. At 11 a.m. Monday, the body will be taken to St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, where Richard Cardinal Cushing of Boston will celebrate a pontifical requiem mass. Mr. Kennedy reportedly will be buried in Boston, near the grave of his infant son, Patrick. In Dallas, District Attorney Henry Wade says officials believe they have enough evidence to convict Lee Oswald. Wade says investigators learned from Oswald's Russian-born wife that he had a rifle of the type used to kill the president. She said he had it with him the night before the assassination. Police claim Oswald was in the building from which the assassin fired the fatal bullet from the president into the president's brain. A German-made rifle, a Mauser, with a telescopic sight which fired the bullet, was found in the Texas School Book Depository building, which police say there were no fingerprints on it. Oswald was arraigned on murder charges late last night, only a few hours after paraffin tests were made on his hands to determine whether he had recently fired a rifle. Police Chief Jesse Curry said Oswald will be brought before a grand jury next week. Oswald also was accused of slaying a policeman who was pursuing him less than 4 miles away from the assassination scene. Oswald ducked into the Bovie Theater after allegedly shooting the policeman. The cashier called police saying there was a suspicious-looking man in the theater. 4 policemen charged into the theater and headed toward Oswald. The suspect pulled out a revolver, but it misfired. The officers dragged him to a police car as he fought to get away. Oswald is said to be a Marxist, and he is for Fidel Castro, apparently the head or chairman of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. In 1959, he turned up at the American Embassy in Moscow, said he wanted to renounce his U.S. citizenship, but the Russians would not grant him Soviet citizenship. Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as the nation's 36th president shortly after President Kennedy's death and immediately returned to Washington to take up his new burdens. On arrival in the capital city, he issued a brief statement calling for the help of God and the American people in his presidential role. Mr. Johnson moved into a series of conferences with top aides and congressional leaders from whom he drew bipartisan pledges of support. And this morning at 11:30 Eastern Standard Time, the new president meets with former President Eisenhower, who several times was consulted by President Kennedy during his 34 months in the White House. In some analysis of the news this morning, it's believed President Johnson will follow the basic foreign policy of his predecessor, President Kennedy. UPI political correspondent Stuart Hensley says the only difference that should emerge is in Mr. Johnson's manner of carrying out the basic tenets of the policy. Diplomatic officials believe the Soviet Union may soon put President Johnson to a test to find out just how he will react under renewed pressures on Berlin and other trouble spots. President Kennedy responded to such pressures by building up U.S. military strength in Europe and making it clear the United States would fight to hold its position in Berlin and elsewhere. Mr. Johnson is inheriting a strong foreign policy, one backed up by the acknowledged nuclear superiority of America. There is no indication he intends to alter the fundamental policy that achieved this position. The assassination of President Kennedy gives the 1964 political picture a different look. The president had been a sure bet to win renomination at the Democratic National Convention next year, and a heavy favorite to win re-election. In modern history, incumbent presidents normally have won second terms. The struggle in the Republican ranks for the presidential nomination already is intense, and that intensity may grow. The GOP nomination might look more attractive, at least until public surveys are made on President Johnson's popularity. The nation's 3 living former presidents expressed grief and shock over the assassination of President Kennedy. Mr. Truman received the news at his home in Independence, Missouri, saying the president's death was a tragedy. Dwight Eisenhower stood red-eyed in New York City and told newsmen the death of his successor was a despicable act. Herbert Hoover, also in New York City, said in his words, "I am shocked and grieved to learn of President Kennedy's assassination." And across the nation, politicians and the man in the street shared the sorrow felt by the former presidents. Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, who often opposed Mr. Kennedy's policies, called the death a profound loss to the nation and the free world, and the loss of a personal friend. Around the world, the news of President Kennedy's death has caused shock and disbelief. A shocked and horrified Queen Elizabeth is leading Britain in mourning for President Kennedy, and the bell of Westminster Abbey is slated to toll 60 times today in tribute. French President de Gaulle commented on the president, saying, "In the name of the French people, I salute this grand example and this grand memory." In Berlin, the West Germans marched in a torchlight parade, weeping for the man who 5 months ago stood before the Berlin Wall and said, "I am a Berliner." Pope Paul VI offered a special mass for the soul of President Kennedy in his private chapel at Vatican City. We have late word from Moscow that Soviet Premier Khrushchev has made his first public comment on President Kennedy's death. On returning to Moscow this morning, Khrushchev called the assassination a heavy blow to all people who hold dear the cause of peace and Soviet-American cooperation. Here's the WLW Weather Service forecast. For Cincinnati and the Ohio Valley, the rains ending this morning, windy and then turning colder today. Temperatures dropping into the 30s. By tonight, partly cloudy, windy, and much colder, with the lows reaching the mid and low 20s. Right now, it's 57 in Cincinnati, across the valley, 56 at Lexington, 58 at Louisville. Columbus, Ohio is 54 degrees. Dayton, Ohio is 57. It's 48 degrees in Indianapolis. So that's the weather and news from WLW Communications Exchange. Wlw-Radio has suspended its regularly scheduled programs during this time of mourning for our late president. We will join the NBC network at 7:30 this morning. Now it's 11 minutes after 5 o'clock in Cincinnati. Continuing with our program of music, we present Virgil Fox playing at the organ of New York City's Riverside Church.
Eastern Standard Time is 7 o'clock. At this time, we'll have the latest news for you from the WLW Communications Exchange. Bill Robbins reporting.
Good morning, everyone. This is a day of grief for the nation. The nation stunned by disbelief almost, although now it's a reality. The former president of the United States, John Kennedy, assassinated yesterday afternoon. The body of President Kennedy was returned to the White House for the last time this morning. A gray Navy ambulance carried the casket from Bethesda Naval Hospital, where the body was kept since yesterday afternoon. Riding in the ambulance were Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Mrs. Kennedy wore the same pink suit she had on in Dallas yesterday. 6 servicemen representing all the military services carried the flag-draped casket from the ambulance to the East Room of the White House, where the body will lie in repose today. Black crepe was in place along the north wall of the room, the largest in the White House. A military honor guard will remain with the casket until it is removed tomorrow to lie in state in the Capitol building. 2 priests also are present to pray for the slain chief executive. Virtually all news today is devoted to the tragic assassination of the president and the events which have taken place in connection with it. Taking time out briefly for a look at other tragic news here in Ohio. Tragedy at Norwalk, Ohio, where between 40 and 60 persons are believed to have died early this morning when flames destroyed a home for the aged south of Norwalk in Huron County. The Ohio Highway Patrol says the fire broke out at the home in Pittsville, a village of less than 500 population, about 10 miles from Norwalk. Patrolman said the home, believed the Golden Agers home, was a total loss, cause of the blaze not known. Normally, the home has a population of about 70 residents. There was no indication the identity of the victims or how many actually died in that fire. A man identified as 38-year-old Basil Matthews died in a fire early today in Cincinnati at 1810 Race Street. A careless smoker was blamed. Turning again to the millions of words which already have been printed and spoken in connection with the president's tragic assassination. In the latest developments, Dallas police have booked 24-year-old Lee Oswald on murder charges in the assassination. Oswald is jailed without bond. Investigators say he was in the building from which the assassin fired the fatal bullet, and they think they have enough evidence to convict him. Oswald, an avowed Marxist and a Castro sympathizer, is charged with the murder of a policeman who tried to apprehend him. The bullets which killed President Kennedy and seriously wounded Texas Governor John Connley were fired from a warehouse called the Texas School Book Depository. Police found the rifle with a telescopic sight, but there were no fingerprints on it. Oswald was given tests to determine whether he'd recently fired a weapon. Governor Connley was reported in good condition after undergoing 4 hours of chest surgery. President Lyndon Johnson has called in Secretary of State Dean Rusk this morning for the first of a full day of top-level meetings. The morning session comes less than 24 hours after the new chief executive was formally sworn in. Mr. Johnson confers later this morning with former President Eisenhower. President Johnson has set up office temporarily in his former vice presidential quarters in the executive office building just west of the White House. He continues to reside at his mansion just outside Washington. Mr. Johnson has set aside a few silent minutes today to lead other top-level officials in viewing the body of the president, President Kennedy. The 2 Kennedy children were asleep in the White House this morning when their father's body was brought in. Mrs. Kennedy is faced with the terrible task of telling them of their father's death. Today, only members of the president's family, cabinet and government leaders, Supreme Court justices, members of Congress, and members of the diplomatic corps will be allowed to view the body. The public will be able to file past the president's casket at the Capitol all day tomorrow and for 1 hour Monday morning. Final rites, with Richard Cardinal Cushing officiating, will be held at noon Monday in Washington. The president probably will be buried in Boston. All over the nation and here in Cincinnati, special services in memory of President Kennedy will be held in churches and other places of worship. A Requiem Mass will be sung at St. Peter and Chains Cathedral in Cincinnati at noon today. St. John's Unitarian Church in Clifton will hold a service tonight between 7 and 8 in tribute to the president. The formal dedication of the new I-75 bridge over the Ohio River between Cincinnati and Covington, Kentucky, has been postponed until a week from Monday night because of the president's death. The bridge itself will be open to traffic Monday afternoon at 3:30 as originally scheduled. So far as the rest of the nation is concerned, it seems that cancellations, postponements, and closings are the order of the day for millions of Americans who halted their normal weekend activities to honor their president. President Kennedy loved to watch the Harvard-Yale football clash that would have been played today. It was canceled, so were scores of other college football games. The lights of Broadway were dimmed last night. Broadway theaters and musical events closed. The Copacabana nightclub and others shut their doors. New Yorkers with the thousands entered St. Patrick's Cathedral to pray for the slain president. Governor and Mrs. Rhodes of Ohio will fly to Washington this morning to view the body of assassinated President Kennedy. The governor and his wife return to Columbus this evening. They will view the remains of the late Mr. Kennedy at the White House this afternoon. Last night, the governor issued a proclamation calling for all national and state flags in Ohio to be flown at half-mast for a 30-day mourning period for Mr. Kennedy. Governor Combs of Kentucky, stunned by the news of President Kennedy's assassination, set aside a speech he had intended to deliver at Founders' Day ceremonies at Morehead State College yesterday. He told his audience instead that a critical moment in the history of the world has been reached. He said the hearts of all Kentuckians go out to the bereaved family of President Kennedy. Within moments of the president's death, flags dropped to half-staff at the state capitol in Frankfort, Kentucky, and elsewhere throughout the Commonwealth. Stunned Hoosiers from all walks of life mourn for the assassinated President Kennedy. From Governor Welch to the man in the street, the people of Indiana were stunned by the news that the president had been shot to death in Dallas. Governor Welch learned of the slaying while attending the Midwest Governors Conference at Omaha, Nebraska, and he called it a great tragedy for all of the people of America and the world. All state offices in Indiana were closed at mid-afternoon yesterday. Flags ordered placed at half-staff in Indiana for 30 days. Major General John Anderson, the state adjutant general, said under a previously prepared plan for any type of emergency, security measures immediately were tightened at all Indiana state military installations. The family of assassinated President Kennedy asked last night that anyone wishing to send flowers to the White House or to the funeral instead donate to charity an equivalent amount of money. In Moscow, Premier Khrushchev expressed sympathy to the American people after hearing about President Kennedy's assassination. Khrushchev said the Soviet people shared the deep grief of American citizens for Mr. Kennedy. He said he had a realistic and broad outlook on international problems. Khrushchev said the base crime evokes indignation in his people. The premier had rushed back to Moscow from the Ukraine on hearing of the tragic event. Khrushchev, accompanied by Foreign Secretary Gromyko, drove to the home of U.S. Ambassador Flory Kohler in the morning rain. Kohler solemnly shook hands with them and led them to a booth where a photograph of President Kennedy lay on a table next to a loose-leaf book. Khrushchev signed the book without speaking, stepped aside, and Gromyko signed. In the United Nations, the Cuban ambassador said his nation received the news of President Kennedy's assassination with profound displeasure. At London, a monitored broadcast by the new China news agency in Peking reported the shooting of Mr. Kennedy, but made no other comment. President Johnson has inherited leadership of the Democratic Party today, along with vast power to shape it for victory or defeat in 1964. The death of President Kennedy so scrambled the political outlook, it'll be months before solid assessments can be made of prospects in the coming presidential election year. At first glance, the change in Democrats in the White House seemed to hurt more than help Senator Goldwater of Arizona. Kennedy had been certain to win renomination and was heavily favored to win re-election because of the built-in advantages of an incumbent president. Inasmuch as Johnson wanted the presidential nomination in 1960, he probably will want it again next August when the Democratic National Convention meets at Atlantic City. In a few days, politicians will be asking how will the shift in the White House affect Republican family warfare over the choice of a Republican nominee next July. And will the policies of Johnson, who is classed as more moderate than the late President Kennedy, provoke a revolt aimed at nominating a more liberal Democratic candidate for the presidency? In any case, President Johnson was certain today to give his driving support to the embattled Kennedy legislative program. Congressional leaders, stunned by President Kennedy's assassination, confessed they might not know the force of Johnson's backing until January. All said it was too early to forecast legislative events. There were no immediate indications that Kennedy's tragic death would break any legislative deadlocks. Congress, it appeared, may start its Christmas recess a week early, but solution to the tax and civil rights problems will await the new president's State of the Union and budget messages next January. Democratic and Republican congressional leaders pledged their personal cooperation to Johnson almost immediately after his return to Washington. But the pledge was not given in terms of legislative objectives as much as in terms of backing in his personal crisis and the continuing fight for world freedom. An acknowledged master in the legislative art, Johnson's years of experience and leadership in Congress were expected to count for much in the months ahead. Senate Democratic Whip Hubert Humphrey said, "We are fortunate that President Johnson is experienced and able as he is." Johnson has been out in front of many administration leaders in urging action of the Kennedy administration's civil rights, tax cut, and space programs, all of which now are under heavy fire. Still awaiting congressional action before the mid-December recess, which will end legislative work for this year, are 8 money bills and 2 major education measures, most of them backed by the late president. Leaders have been counting on disposing of these at least before quitting for 1963. After their 20-minute meeting with the new president, the bipartisan group of leaders agreed to a joint statement of their personal cooperation and friendship, and then slipped away to their homes and offices to recover from the afternoon's shocking event. We've been telling you about cancellations of various events as a result of the tragic assassination of the president. The Ohio State Buckeyes clash with Michigan will be held at Ann Arbor, the game clouded, though, by the horrors of the president's assassination. Now, the smallest crowd in 20 years is expected to attend the traditional game. Sporting events all over the nation were sharply curtailed as a result of the president's death. Among contests not postponed or canceled were 2 which have a direct bearing on conference championships and New Year's Day bowl invitations. Illinois will tangle with Michigan State for the Big Ten crown and a trip to the Rose Bowl, while the other contest pits Oklahoma against Nebraska for the Big 8 championship and an Orange Bowl bid. Other games still scheduled to be played are, as we mentioned, the Michigan-Ohio State game and the Kentucky-Tennessee game. In the American Football League, an announcement was made last night. 4 games slated for Sunday have been postponed and will be rescheduled. Under the most difficult conditions, athletic directors of both the University of Kentucky and the University of Tennessee decided to continue with their plans for that scheduled game today at Lexington. Over in Indiana, the traditional Old Oak and Bucket football clash between Indiana and Purdue at Bloomington was canceled. 3 of the National Basketball Association's 4 games scheduled for tonight are expected to be played. All NBA action last night was canceled because of the death of President Kennedy. The Cincinnati Royals are scheduled to play at St. Louis. In college football, the University of Cincinnati-Miami game will be played at 2 o'clock at Nippert Stadium here in Cincinnati today. That decision made after lengthy discussions between school officials following the assassination of President Kennedy. And Xavier's Musketeers are scheduled to play Bowling Green's Falcons at Bowling Green, Ohio, this afternoon. Another story from Cincinnati. 83-year-old Louis Dahman of 3405 Telford Avenue in Clifton was fatally injured last night when he was hit by an automobile at Clifton and Hosea Avenues. Mr. Dahman had retired 11 years ago after 43 years with the Cincinnati Waterworks. Again, repeating that all over the Cincinnati area and around the nation, special services in memory of President Kennedy are being held in churches and other places of worship. A Requiem Mass will be sung at St. Peter and Chains Cathedral here in Cincinnati at noon today. And a reminder to motorists that the formal dedication of the new I-75 bridge over the Ohio River between Cincinnati and Covington, Kentucky, has been postponed until a week from Monday night because of the President's death. The bridge itself will be open to traffic Monday afternoon at 3:30 as originally scheduled. Wlw-Radio joins its listeners in an expression of deep sorrow at the death of President Kennedy.
The weather forecast for the tri-state area today: cloudy, windy, and turning colder with light rain ending in the forenoon. Temperatures falling into the 30s. Clearing and much colder tonight, lows in the mid-20s. Sunday's weather, fair and cold. The present temperature in Cincinnati, 53 degrees. That's the latest news from WLW's Communications Exchange. Bill Robbins reporting. WLW has suspended its regularly scheduled programs during this time of mourning for our late President, John F. Kennedy. We ask you to join with us in prayer for John Kennedy, his bereaved family, and President Lyndon Johnson. 15 minutes after 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, we are expecting to rejoin the National Broadcasting Company coverage at 7:30 this morning. In the meantime, we'll continue with recorded music. Wlw-Radio has suspended its regularly scheduled programs during this time of mourning for our late President, John F. Kennedy. We ask you to join with us in prayer for John Kennedy, his bereaved family, and President Lyndon Johnson. This is the nation station, WLW, in Cincinnati. Due to special programming on the assassination of President Kennedy, the Signal 3 and Midwestern Hayride television programs will not be telecast today. Audiences planning to attend these programs are asked not to come to the WLW television studios for these programs today. Eastern Standard Time is 7:30. We now join the NBC Radio Network.
This is NBC News, beginning its continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of President Kennedy. Now here is Russ Ward, NBC News.
The body of President John F. Kennedy during the early hours of this morning was returned to the White House for the last time. The body will lie in repose throughout the day while close friends and high government officials pay their respects. In Dallas, Texas, a 24-year-old man who has professed his love for Russia and has many times in the past denounced capitalism, has been charged with murder in the president's assassination. Lee Harvey Oswald, held without bail, proclaims his innocence. Dallas District Attorney Henry Wade says there is no one else but him. Around the world, the reaction is universal. Shock at the act of murder, sorrow for the president's family. Soviet Premier Khrushchev went to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow to personally pay his condolences. Pope Paul VI proclaimed, "We deplore this event with all our heart." UN Secretary General U Thant expressed profound sorrow at this most tragic event. Now for the full story in detail. First, we go to NBC's Richard Valeriani in Washington.
The late President John Fitzgerald Kennedy came back to the White House for the last time early today, borne in a bronze casket draped with an American flag. A light gray Navy hearse bearing the casket rolled slowly through the Pennsylvania Avenue entrance and pulled up to the front door of the Executive Mansion just before 4:30. About 500 mourners stood outside the gate and watched in silence in the chill morning air. Preceding the hearse, a 13-man Marine honor guard, their bayonets glinting in the glare of camera lights, marched with sorrowful step along the drive which curves around the White House lawn. Flames from 12 smudge pots flickered along the driveway. The president's widow, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, sat in the hearse beside the casket on the 25-minute drive from Bethesda Naval Hospital. Mrs. Kennedy rode with her arms stretched across the coffin. She was wearing the same pink suit that was spattered with blood when the president was shot. As she stepped from the hearse, she seemed to stumble. The Attorney General took her arm, and they followed as an honor guard representing all 4 military services carried the casket into the White House. Black bunting hung around the door in stark contrast to the white facade of the Executive Mansion. The casket, mounted on a catafalque and flanked by 2 burning candles, will lie in repose in the East Room of the White House during the day for viewing by members of the family, President Lyndon Johnson, and other high officials of the government and foreign diplomats. Above the White House, the American flag flies at half-mast. Richard Valeriani, NBC News, at the White House in Washington.
The new president, 55-year-old Lyndon Johnson, is scheduled to hold a late morning conference with Dwight Eisenhower, the 34th President of the United States. Also on Mr. Johnson's calling list this morning, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, presumably for a talk on the problems that confront the nation around the world. At mid-afternoon, Mr. Johnson is to meet with his cabinet. On arrival in Washington last night from Dallas, the scene of the tragedy, President Johnson told the American people, "I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's." He then held an immediate conference with several of his cabinet members and with congressional leaders of both parties. The word went out that these leaders had given him hearty assurances of bipartisan support. Only a few hours before, Mr. Johnson had taken the presidential oath in a jet plane standing on a Dallas runway, ready to depart for Washington. The ceremony witnessed by the newly widowed Jacqueline Kennedy, her clothing still stained from her husband's blood. Less than 12 hours after Mr. Kennedy was cut down in his ceremonial limousine by rifle bullets from a sniper, charges were filed against 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald, who had professed love for Russia and once tried to renounce his American citizenship. District Attorney Henry Wade of Dallas, Texas, was asked if authorities were still looking for anyone else in connection with the murder. Said Wade, there is no one else but him. Taken before microphones and cameras during the early hours of this morning, Oswald managed an occasional smile as he insisted in a low voice that he was innocent of the death of Mr. Kennedy. Earlier, he had declared, I did not kill the president, I did not kill anyone. Wade was asked if he regarded Oswald as communist-inspired or just a nut, and he put it this way, well, I don't think he's a nut, I think he is sane. Oswald had been taken into custody soon after Mr. Kennedy was fatally shot, and shortly after Texas Governor John Connley wounded by 3 volleys fired from the high-powered rifle. In Brookline, Massachusetts, a monument 4 feet high and 7 feet long rests on a gentle knoll in Hollywood Cemetery. The word Kennedy carved across the front of the white granite slab. Off slightly to one side is a small marker. It reads Patrick Bouvier Kennedy. The site is the family plot where President Kennedy probably will be buried beside his infant son, who died August 9th, 2 days after birth. Police are maintaining a 24-hour watch to protect the plot from the curious and from the sympathetic. Tragedy, no stranger to the Kennedy family. 3 of the 9 children born to the former U.S. Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy and his wife, Rose, now are dead. 1 murdered, 2 in plane crashes. The 4th, a lifelong patient in a mental hospital. Joseph Kennedy, the 74-year-old multimillionaire father, suffered a crippling stroke in December of 1961. Confined to a wheelchair, he has around-the-clock nurses and can say only one word clearly, that word, no. Now for more reaction from abroad to the tragedy that is being felt around the world. We go to John Rich in Tokyo.
The hammer and sickle flag flew at half-mast today over the Soviet embassy in Tokyo in honor of President Kennedy. This unusual sight somehow didn't seem out of place at all to Americans here who have now gone through a full day, one that started at dawn in shock and disbelief and ended in mourning. In late afternoon, memorial services were held at American military installations throughout Asia. Servicemen in Japan, on Okinawa, in dugouts along the truce line in Korea, knelt in prayers for their former commander-in-chief. The Asians, among whom these thousands of Americans live, made touching efforts to share the Americans' grief. Americans have been stopped on the streets by Japanese wanting to express their regrets. Here in Tokyo, 5 Russian men came up to an American girl and told her how sorry they felt. No other news has been in the papers, nothing else carried on radio or television except the death of President Kennedy. John Rich, NBC News, Tokyo.
In London, Queen Elizabeth II of Britain said, I am shocked and horrified to learn of the tragic death of President Kennedy. On behalf of my peoples, I send my sincere sympathy to the government and to the Congress and to the people of the United States of America. British Prime Minister Sir Alec Douglas Hume said, recall him as a just man, a man who hated bigotry, who believed all men were equal in the sight of God, and acted on that belief. Said Sir Winston Churchill, the assassination was a monstrous act which has taken from us a great statesman and a wise and valiant man. The loss to the United States and to the world is incalculable. Former President Harry Truman, reported ill and unable to come to Washington to pay personal respects to Mr. Kennedy, said the president's death is a great personal loss to the country and to me. He was an able president, one the people loved and trusted. Former President Eisenhower said, I share the sense of shock and dismay that all Americans feel at the despicable act that resulted in the death of our nation's president. Said former President Herbert Hoover, he loved America and has given his life for his country. From the Vatican City, a message from Pope Paul VI. We deplore this event with all our heart. We express the hope that the death of this great statesman shall not harm the American people, but reinforce their moral and civic sense and strengthen their feelings of nobility and concord. And we pray to God that the sacrifice of John Kennedy may advance the cause which he promoted and defended for the freedom of peoples and the peace of the world. A late report now from Dallas, Texas, the scene of the assassination. Pierce Allman, station WFAA in Dallas.
Lee Harvey Oswald, charged with murdering the President of the United States and a Dallas policeman, defected to Russia in 1959. In 1962, he returned to the United States, and in August this year, he passed out pro-Castro leaflets on a New Orleans street. On September 26th, President Kennedy announced plans for a trip to Dallas. A few days later, Oswald got a job in the Texas School Book Depository building overlooking the motorcade route. On October 14th, he rented a room in Dallas, and yesterday was seen by R.S. Truly, the building superintendent, and a Dallas policeman in the book firm building just after a barrage of shots from the 6th floor struck the president and Governor John Connley. O.V. Campbell, the vice president of the firm, said he and Truly, the superintendent, ran toward a grassy knoll west of the building where he thought the sniper had hidden. In a storage room on the first floor, a police officer, gun drawn, spotted Oswald and asked the superintendent, "Does this man work here?" Truly, who said he had interviewed and hired Oswald a couple of months earlier, reportedly told the policeman at that time that Oswald was a worker. The policeman and Truly continued their search of the building, and Lee Harvey Oswald strolled out the front door. He later failed to report at a 1:15 p.m. roll call of employees, and Truly reported this to police. When the assassin was dragged from the darkened Texas Theater in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas yesterday afternoon, he was screaming, "I protest this police brutality." And a crowd of several hundred citizens were pressing forward chanting, "Kill him! Kill him!" And had not officers moved quickly and with authority, 24-year-old Lee H. Oswald might have suffered a worse fate than the world leader he suspected of killing. Governor John Connley is in satisfactory condition this morning, though he is under heavy sedation. He has not yet been told of the fate of the President of the United States. And ironically enough, it was luck that saved the governor's life, for after hearing the first shot, had he not turned his head, the bullet from the sniper would have entered his heart. This is Piers Allman, WFAA Dallas, for NBC News.
The body of John F. Kennedy, the 35th president, lay in repose this morning in the East Room of the White House. A gray ambulance from the U.S. Bethesda Naval Hospital carried the body of the former chief executive from the hospital through the streets of Washington during the early hours of this morning. Hundreds of persons who had been gathered at across Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House for hours, many of them still there watching in silence as the ambulance entered the White House North Gate. Behind the closed curtains of the vehicle, the former president's wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, laden with the burden of her grief, she was still wearing the same pink suit she wore in Dallas yesterday. Also in the ambulance, the president's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. The casket was placed on a catafalque in the center of the room, a military honor guard taking its position, and two priests kneeling to pray the night through for the Kennedy family. Tomorrow at 1 p.m., the president's body will be moved from the White House in a formal funeral cortege to the great rotunda of the Capitol, about half a mile down Pennsylvania Avenue, there to lie in state until 10 a.m. Monday. At 11 o'clock Monday, the president's body to be removed to St. Matthew's Cathedral for the funeral mass at noon. Richard Cardinal Cushing, Roman Catholic Archbishop of Boston, will be the celebrant. The president is expected to be buried near his infant son, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, in the family plot at Brookline, Massachusetts, his birthplace. Now more reaction from abroad to this tragic loss to the United States and to the world. We go to NBC's Analdo Lacanina in Beirut.
News of President Kennedy's assassination stunned the Arab world out of its present complications and into concern over the world's future. Arabs everywhere who normally tune to the voice of the Arabs from Cairo listened all night to stations carrying the latest news on the president's death. Radio and television stations throughout the Middle East interrupted their regular programs. Here in Beirut, television viewers watched a station announcer push a singer away from the microphone to break news of the president's assassination. The Lebanese foreign minister immediately phoned the American ambassador to express his country's shock over the death of President Kennedy. The new president, Lyndon Johnson, won popularity here in the Middle East during a tour of the area last year because of his folksy ways. One Lebanese, hearing that Mr. Johnson had just been sworn president, asked if he was the same man who had bought a watermelon in Beirut. He alluded to one of Mr. Johnson's famous motorcade stops when he walked over to a watermelon stand to talk to a boy running it and was given one as a present. Arnaldo Lacanina, NBC News, Beirut.
The new president, Lyndon Johnson, is regarded as certain to give his support to the embattled Kennedy legislative program. His congressional leaders confessed they might not know the force of Johnson's backing until January. All said it was too early to forecast legislative events. There were no immediate indications that President Kennedy's tragic death would break any legislative deadlocks. Congress, apparently, will start its Christmas recess a week early. But solution of the tax cut and the civil rights problems will await the new president's State of the Union and budget messages next January. Democratic and Republican congressional leaders pledged their personal cooperation to the new president almost immediately after his return to Washington. But the pledge was not given in terms of legislative objectives, so much as in terms of backing in his personal crisis and in the continuing fight for world freedom. An acknowledged master of legislative procedures, Lyndon Johnson's years of experience and leadership in Congress are expected to count for much in the months ahead. Said the Senate Democratic whip, Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, "We are fortunate that President Johnson is experienced and able as he is." That tells quite a story in itself. The stunned nation, facing today a gradual but perceptible change of course under its new president, Johnson can be expected to continue the international policies of John F. Kennedy, which he has said repeatedly have put the communists on the defensive by giving the non-communist world the initiative. But domestically, a reorientation of policies and of political action appears inevitable. Labels always inadequate to describe the complexities of political beliefs, but the assassinated President Kennedy was basically liberal and his successor fundamentally conservative. This puts an entirely new complexion on the 1964 presidential contest if Johnson is the Democratic nominee, as he seems likely to become. We repeat, the body of the slain John F. Kennedy in repose this morning at the White House. In Dallas, Texas, a 24-year-old man, Lee Oswald, charged with murder and held without bail in the assassination of the president. Tomorrow, Mr. Kennedy's body to be borne by a solemn cortege to the rotunda of the Capitol, where it will lie in state for 24 hours to be seen by the public. Hundreds of thousands of persons expected to file past the catafalque. Funeral services to be held at noon Monday at St. Matthew's Roman Catholic Cathedral in Washington, with Richard Cardinal Cushing, Archbishop of Boston and longtime friend of the Kennedy family, celebrating a pontifical requiem mass. The final resting place for the 46-year-old former president remains uncertain this morning. Possibly he will be buried in Brookline, Massachusetts, at the family plot there. In the early hours of this morning, the flag-draped casket of the fallen president was brought to the White House from the Bethesda Naval Hospital near Washington. Reaction to this tragic event continues to pour in from all corners of the world. We go now to Wilson Hall in Rio de Janeiro.
Brazilians are as shocked as the rest of the world at the assassination of President Kennedy. President Goulart ordered all flags in Brazil to fly at half-mast for 3 days. Radio stations have switched from their usual sambas to play serious music interspersed with late news of the death of Mr. Kennedy. Long lines of people are outside newspaper offices lined up to sign messages of sympathy, which will be sent to Mrs. Kennedy. Editorials are unanimous in praising President Kennedy's intense interest in Latin America and his world leadership for peace with freedom. The Brazilian government of President Goulart was having its disagreements with the U.S. government. However, the outpouring of sorrow and sympathy from all Brazilians, from the president to the man in the street, show that President Kennedy, as a person and a leader, was deeply and genuinely admired. Wilson Hall, NBC News, Rio de Janeiro.
Other reaction now? Let's go to Joseph C. Harsh, NBC News, London.
Yes, I'm here.
Joseph?
Here's what's actually going on right now here, Russ. The great bell at Westminster Abbey is tolling for the first time since the death of King George VI. Usually it tolls only for royalty. It's ringing once a minute. The court has gone into official mourning for a week. Flags are at half-staff on all public buildings. This will be repeated on the day of the funeral. The Archbishop of Canterbury has called for prayers in all churches tomorrow. Parliament will assemble on Monday to hear tributes to President Kennedy, and then it will adjourn. The American embassy is remaining open over the weekend so that persons wishing to do so can sign the book of condolences in the main lobby. Over 1,000 came in last night, and another 500 or 600 this morning, mostly British. Individual Americans here have been frequently receiving telegrams and telephone calls from their British friends offering their sympathy. A difficult incident occurred in a fashionable hotel bar here last night when one group of Americans shocked other persons present by raising glasses joyfully to what they called improved Goldwater for President prospects. Joseph C. Harsh, NBC News, London.
Joseph, could you give us a little idea of the scene at the American embassy there when the news was first reached?
Oh, Russ, that was last night. Of course, we were here in the office trying to keep up here. I wasn't there in person, but I got a report on it from one of my friends at the embassy who said it was just extraordinary the way people drifted in. Mostly British, curiously a mixed crowd of people. This wasn't upper-class snob stuff at all. Just plain people off the street, kids in boots and blue jeans and all that, coming in just saying, we're sorry and can we do something? Can we say something? And they put a table in the lobby and people started writing notes on paper, and then they put a book on it for people to sign.
The loss here, as you can imagine, is personal on the parts of hundreds of thousands. I wonder if the loss in Britain and some of the other major Western capitals is much the same. Do they regard this man in personal terms?
You know, Russ, I'm startled at how much it does seem to be a personal loss to them. For example, I went over to the BBC last night to do a broadcast for them. They asked me to interpret what was happening. And every person I came to, before saying anything else, said, may I express my great sorrow at the loss you have had and that we feel it too. And this came from the heart. This wasn't formality. I would have thought that the sense of personal loss here in Britain is just as strong as in America, conceivably stronger. I don't know. We did hear one extraordinary broadcast back from some British correspondent who'd been flying to Texas, and he's told about going through an airport, I think it was Oklahoma City, where nobody was paying any attention. He was shocked at how little attention American people were paying to it. Whereas here, everybody just went around feeling and looking shocked, and I think were.
Joseph, we thank you very much. We'll be back in touch with you later today.
Right.
House Speaker John McCormick, the 71-year-old veteran of nearly half a century in politics, now stands as first in line of succession to the presidency. There now being no vice president, if President Johnson should be unable to serve, he would be succeeded by Speaker McCormick. McCormick heard yesterday from newsmen on the Capitol beat about the attack on President Kennedy. The speaker was seated at lunch, not in the members' private dining room, but in the outer house restaurant where clerks and reporters also are served. McCormick's reaction was a brief, "My God." He paused and said he knew Americans of all faiths were praying for the president. Then he put down his Spoon went with newsmen to the White House to the House of Representatives press gallery, where he and many others watched closely as the teletypes brought in further news of the tragedy. The public is to be permitted to file past Mr. Kennedy's bier in the great rotunda of the Capitol shortly after its arrival at 9 a.m. tomorrow until 9 p.m., and then again on Monday from 9 a.m. until 10 a.m. Afterward, the body will be taken to St. Matthew's Roman Catholic Cathedral in Washington for funeral services. In Dallas, Texas, authorities have arrested 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald for the assassination of Mr. Kennedy. They say no one else but Oswald is responsible for the killing. Oswald, who has professed love for Russia, who once tried to renounce his American citizenship, who holds a dishonorable discharge from the U.S. Marines, also is charged with killing a Dallas, Texas policeman who tried to question him. The youth was charged less than 12 hours after the president was killed with a shot from the 5th floor of an office building as he traveled in his motorcade through Dallas streets. Governor John Connley of Texas is reported in satisfactory condition after undergoing surgery for a bullet wound in the chest. Connley was riding in the same open automobile with the president during yesterday's tragedy. Mrs. Connley in the car also, as was Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy. Neither women hurt in that attack. John F. Kennedy, slain by a hidden sniper in Dallas, Texas. The body returned to the White House for the last time early today. In the Navy ambulance, traveling from the Bethesda Naval Hospital to the White House, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy and the President's brother, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Mrs. Kennedy, sitting beside the casket as the procession wheeled down Pennsylvania Avenue and turned into the northwest entrance to the White House. The ambulance arrived during the early hours of this morning, shortly before 4:30 Eastern Standard Time, and even at that time, hundreds of persons gathered on Pennsylvania Avenue, standing quietly, expressionless, paying their respects to the slain president. From the Far East now, reaction to the tragedy. John Sharkey, NBC News, Saigon.
Almost to a man, the 16,000 American military and civilian personnel here expressed total disbelief at the first news of President Kennedy's assassination. With confirmation, shock replaced incredulity. Normal routines halted as officials tried to assess the consequences of the tragedy. It was in President Kennedy's first year in office that the decision was made to bolster American support for the war against the communist guerrillas. But Vietnamese and foreign diplomats say they are still too shocked to gauge what the news means. An Australian embassy official said, "We are stunned. It was like a personal loss." This is John Sharkey, NBC News, Saigon.
At the White House this morning, from 10 to 11 a.m., President Kennedy's immediate family is to view the body in the large white and gold East Room of the White House. From 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., top officials of the government, led by the new President, Lyndon Johnson, and including the Speaker of the House, John McCormick, and Chief Justice Earl Warren, are scheduled to arrive. Former President Eisenhower is scheduled to come to the White House at that time. Former President Herbert Hoover, 89 years old and in ill health, has expressed regrets that he will be unable to attend. Former President Truman also reported ill and unable to come to Washington. Cabinet members, officials of the executive branch appointed by the President, and close personal friends invited to view the body from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. From 2 to 2:30 p.m. this afternoon, Associate Justices of the Supreme Court and members of the federal judiciary scheduled to call at the White House, while from 2:30 to 5, members of Congress and governors expected, followed by the diplomatic corps from 5 to 6 p.m. this afternoon. Tomorrow at 1 o'clock, members of the family, Supreme Court justices, members of Congress, and foreign diplomats to accompany President Kennedy's body as it's moved from the White House down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol building. The public then will be permitted to file past the bier in the great rotunda of the Capitol shortly after its arrival until 9 p.m. tomorrow night, and then again on Monday from 9 until 10 a.m. At 11 o'clock Monday morning, the body to be taken to the cathedral for the funeral services. Cardinal Cushing, who will say the funeral mass, gave the invocation at President Kennedy's inauguration. He officiated at the president's marriage. He baptized the 2 Kennedy children. And he said the funeral mass last August for the president's newborn son, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We now pause 10 seconds for station identification.
Wlw-Radio joins its listeners in an expression of deep sorrow in the death of our president. WLW, Cincinnati.
This is Russ Ward in the NBC newsroom in New York, continuing with around-the-clock coverage on NBC of the events surrounding the death of President John F. Kennedy. The casket of the fallen president is at the White House, taken there during the early hours of this morning from Bethesda Naval Hospital. First Lady Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy rode alongside the casket, as did the Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Throughout the day, the president's body to be viewed by his family, close friends, and Thai government officials. Tomorrow, the president's body will be seen by the public as it lies in state for 24 hours in the rotunda of the Capitol building. Funeral services to be held on Monday. The public will be permitted to file past the bier of the great rotunda of the Capitol shortly after its arrival at 9 a.m. until 9 p.m. tomorrow, and again on Monday from 9 a.m. until 10 p.m. In Dallas, Texas, authorities have arrested 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald for the assassination of the president. They say no one but Oswald is responsible for the killing. Oswald claims he is innocent. The youth was charged less than 12 hours after the president was killed with a shot from the 5th floor of a building as he motored through Dallas. From abroad, reaction, the same universal feeling of tragedy. We hear from Phyllis Hepp in Nairobi, Kenya.
The news of the assassination of President Kennedy was received here as an unbelievable, incomprehensible shock. Kenya's Prime Minister Jomo Kenyatta called the American Consul General Lawrence Bass at his home in the early hours of the morning to express his deep-felt shock and horror at the news of the president's murder. Mr. Kenyatta, speaking personally and on behalf of the people of Kenya, asked the Consul General to convey his heartfelt condolences to Mrs. Kennedy, the members of the Kennedy family, and all the American people in their hour of great bereavement. Mr. Kenyatta, who will lead the Kenya delegation to the United Nations in New York next month, had asked that arrangements be made for him to personally meet President Kennedy on December the 19th. Mr. Kenyatta had received official confirmation of this meeting only a few hours before the news of the president's assassination reached Kenya. This is Phyllis Hepp, NBC News, Nairobi.
Lyndon Johnson today meets the responsibilities of President of the United States, grimly determined to carry on the task left him by John F. Kennedy, less than 24 hours after he was formally sworn in that presidential airplane in Dallas, Texas. The new chief executive called in Secretary of State Dean Rusk for the first of a full day of top-level meetings. Among other officials, Johnson is to confer with former President Eisenhower, with whom Mr. Kennedy also consulted a number of times during periods of national crisis. Amid these urgent meetings, Johnson has set aside a few silent moments for the body of his predecessor, who was felled by an assassin's bullet in Dallas yesterday. The body of the former president lying in repose in the East Room of the White House. The late president to be viewed during a 3-hour period at midday by President Johnson, former President Eisenhower, Chief Justice Earl Warren, Speaker John McCormick, cabinet members, and executive appointees and close personal friends of the late John F. Kennedy. Other reaction now from abroad. We go to Alvin Rosenfeld, NBC News, Jerusalem.
A tired old statesman who no longer holds power and speaks only for himself has expressed the thoughts of many on the death of President Kennedy. He is David Ben-Gurion, the aged ex-premier of Israel, who lives in a desert outpost in the barren Negev. He has no staff of his own, and he composes all his statements by hand. Today he sent a handwritten message to the American ambassador saying, and I quote, "I can hardly tell how distressed and shocked I am by the terribly tragic loss of the great, courageous, wise, and peace-loving president. The whole free world has lost a great leader." Then Ben-Gurion, this old man, this old leader, added these words, "I am asking, why? Why?" Unquote. It is a question which all of Israel and perhaps the whole world asks today on the senseless death of the American president. This is Alvin Rosenfeld, NBC News, Jerusalem.
From London, British Prime Minister Sir Alec Douglas Hume plans to fly to Washington for the funeral of the president. This, according to authoritative sources in the British capital. The Prime Minister was understood anxious to pay personal tribute to the late president. His presence in Washington expected to provide the occasion also for his first get-together with President Lyndon Johnson to appraise the new situation and the future course of the Western Alliance. Other British leaders may also fly to Washington, and arrangements are currently under discussion in the cabinet. Soviet Premier Khrushchev, wearing a black suit and silver tie, paid his personal respects this morning at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko and Mikhail Smirnovsky, head of the Foreign Ministry's American Department, also signed the book at the U.S. Embassy. U.S. Marine Corporal Howard Sperry of Asbury, New Jersey, stood at attention near the table as the Soviet officials arrived to pay their respects. Khrushchev made no public comment, but retired with Ambassador Foy Kohler into a ground-floor sitting room for a long private conversation, which Soviet sources said was, quote, very serious. An attractive Russian redhead brought a huge bouquet of white flowers to the embassy today. She said, as she left the bouquet, "I brought them because I liked your president so much." Now, from the Italian capital, reaction as we call in Irving R. Levine in Rome.
Flags are flying at half-staff in Italy and in the little Vatican state. It's the first time the Vatican ever has lowered its white and yellow flag for the death of a head of state. Pope Paul, who addressed a message to the American people last night saying he was saddened by the shocking crime, celebrated a private mass early this morning for the dead president. In St. Peter's Basilica, participants at the Ecumenical Council had gathered for a mass for cardinals who had died in the past year. Now the mass was also dedicated to the assassinated president. At the American Embassy, Italian political leaders are calling on Ambassador Frederick Reinhardt to express condolences. Several hundred Italians and Americans, tourists and residents, have been entering the embassy all morning to sign a book of condolences. Well over 2,000 people already have signed the book. Irving R. Levine, NBC News, Rome.
Irving, Russ Ward in New York. We've just received word from London that British Prime Minister Sir Alec Douglas Hume may fly to Washington for the funeral. Do you know of any such arrangements on the part of Italian government officials?
There is no word on that yet, Russ. One thing which might hinder it is the fact that Italy is today in a political crisis. It is without a government. There is no prime minister installed. Premier designate Aldo Moro is trying to form a government, and if he succeeds, he would, of course, be the proper representative to attend that ceremony. And at the moment, he is not officially the prime minister.
Joseph Harsh described to us a few moments ago the sense of personal loss on the part of the people in the British capital. I wonder if you found that true in Rome.
Yes, indeed. President Kennedy was tremendously popular here. Of course, he had been in Italy not very long ago, in the beginning of July. His wife had been here as well once before and had passed through here on her way to Greece. The Kennedys were immensely popular, and I think in the newspaper headlines today in Rome, we sense the personal loss that is felt, such headlines as "a grave loss for humanity," a tragedy for the United States and for the world. And in personal conversations with individual Italians, one finds a sense of shock, a sense of loss, of personal loss.
Pope Paul VI seemed to me to have made a moving statement. Do you feel that his sense of personal loss was greater because he seemed so close to the president, possibly because of the president's religion?
Certainly, Pope Paul, who was ordinarily an extremely taciturn man, one not given to making statements often or frequently, has issued a very great number of statements since the president's death. I think that this is perhaps in part due to the fact that he met the president, was impressed by him, partially perhaps, as you suggest, by the fact that he was the first Catholic president, but basically because of the shock of this terrible occurrence. The Pope, as you know, last night sent a personal message to the American people. Today he has sent condolence cables to Lyndon Johnson, to Jacqueline Kennedy, to Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Kennedy, to Robert Kennedy, and to Cardinal Cushing. Also, the Pope this morning received representatives of the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization who are meeting in Rome, and he started that audience with words about the president. I'd be glad to read them to you, Russ, if you have the time now.
Please do, Irving.
This audience was for the representatives of the 12th Annual Conference of the Food and Agricultural Organization, but the Pope started out by saying, "Your Excellencies and gentlemen, while we welcome you here today, we cannot commence our discourse without a reference to the tragic death of the President of the United States of America, John Fitzgerald Kennedy." The Pope went on, "We wish to reiterate here the sentiments to which we have already given public expression of deploration of the criminal action, of admiration for the man and the statesman, of prayers for his eternal repose, for his country and for the world, which recognized in him a great leader." And finally, concluded the Pope, "of prayerful wishes that his death may not hinder the cause of peace, but serve as a sacrifice and an example for the good of all mankind." Those were the Pope's words in his latest comment of several comments made on the death of President Kennedy.
Irving, thank you very much. We'll be in touch with you throughout the day. Foreign newspapers are making these editorial comments today on the death of the president. From the Times in London, President Kennedy was a president who consciously felt that he was challenged to carry forward the implications of Lincoln's work, and who in this last year has been seen wrestling in America with the critical issues of race and national unity. President Johnson will have to face the same challenge, since the underlying stake is the unity of the American people. From the London and Manchester Guardian, President Kennedy was in Texas to gather support for his civil rights program. Like Lincoln before him, it has cost him his life. From the Daily Herald in the British capital, any statesman who stands for sanity and democracy and liberal ideals risked being the target for fanatics. The Stalins of the world mostly die in their beds. It is the Lincolns and the Kennedys who are shot down. From Vancouver, British Columbia, he chose the glory road, the road chosen by those who have the look of eagles, the high and dangerous road that winds beside chasms and precipices that daunt lesser men. In peace or war, John Fitzgerald Kennedy never flinched from duty, whatever the dangers or consequences. From Regina, Saskatchewan, Mr. Kennedy did not quail before duties and responsibilities as he saw them, because of personal animosities he might arouse. He mingled freely among peoples everywhere, even on visits outside his country, despite the danger of assassination at the hands of a frenzied crackpot, perhaps someone who violently disagreed with his integration policies and his love of liberty for all. From the Philippines Herald in Manila, President Kennedy, no less than the immortal Abraham Lincoln, will be enshrined in the hearts of his fellow men for a similar ambition, the final step of emancipation, begun by the great American president of the Negro people of the United States. In the Soviet capital, Soviet Premier Khrushchev had these words: "The death of President Kennedy is a hard blow to all people who cherish the cause of peace and Soviet-American cooperation. heinous assassination of the United States President at a time when there appeared signs of relaxation of international tension evokes the indignation of the Soviet people against the culprits of this basic crime. In Japan, the Japanese destroyer Captain, whose ship almost killed John F. Kennedy back in 1943 during the days of World War II, said today, "The world has lost an irreplaceable man, for there is no other president who worked for peace like he did." We now go to Washington and Peter Jfk'S for late word on the new president of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson.
Standing here in the chilly dawn, a handful of reporters and photographers awaiting the departure of President Lyndon Johnson from his home, the Elms, in the Spring Valley section of northwest Washington. The Johnson car, with its familiar license tag 111, we've been told is due to leave momentarily. There'll be a 10 to 12-minute drive from his residence here to the White House. 6 motorcycle policemen ready to escort the new president. There's a detail of 15 city policemen on duty. They have just relieved another detail of equal number who've been stationed here throughout the night. The sergeant in charge of the detail tells me that all was quiet. There were a few cars which drove by, sightseers wanting to see where President Johnson lives. Other than that, nothing disturbed the peace here in Spring Valley. The home of President Johnson is a large 9-bedroom whitewashed brick house which was once owned by Pearl Mesta. At that time it was called Les Ormes, which in French means the Elms, and Mr. Johnson promptly, when he bought the house, turned the name to English and it became the Elms. It's a French provincial-style home with a circular driveway just across from which I'm standing at the moment. The driveway at this time is barred by 2 iron gates, which will be opened in just a few minutes. Standing behind the 2 gates are 4 Washington, D.C. policemen and an equal number of plainclothes Secret Service men just now standing by, awaiting the time when the new president leaves for downtown. He is due to have lunch at the White House with Secretary of State Dean Rusk at about 9 o'clock. We've been told that his schedule today is subject to change, of course. Later on during the morning, President Johnson is scheduled to meet with former President Eisenhower, who has arrived here in the Capitol. And sometime between 11 and noon this morning, Mr. Johnson and his family and several of the top government officials are scheduled to view the body of the late President Kennedy as it rests in the East Room of the White House. There are a few neighbors who have gathered here outside the Johnson home, perhaps as many as 50, most of them children. They're used to seeing Mr. Johnson in that car, that black limousine of his, as he drives off each day to work, so this won't be anything new. It's a rather gray, damp day here. We had a little drizzle earlier. At the moment it's not raining, but the weather forecast is for drizzle or for rain sometime during the day. The police detail has just been told to put on its raincoats.
A brief recap now of the situation surrounding the events of the death of former President Kennedy. The president's body, during the early hours of this morning, was returned to the White House for the last time. A Navy ambulance with the casket, with Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy and with the president's brother Robert, pulled up to the north portico of the executive mansion at 4:25 a.m. The body will lie in repose throughout the day, while close friends and high government officials pay their respects. In Dallas, Texas, 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald, protesting his innocence, has been charged with murder in the assassination of the president. Dallas District Attorney Henry Wade says there is no one else but him. Around the world, reaction to the events of the past few hours, a shock at this act of murder, sorrow and grief for the family of the late president, Soviet Premier Khrushchev among those paying personal condolences to the late president and to his family. Other reaction now as we hear from John Chancellor in Berlin.
There is in Berlin today, public and private, official and unofficial mourning for President Kennedy. All flags, Berlin, German, and Allied, are at half-mast, and various civil and military observations have taken place. But the real grief is a personal one for the people of Berlin, who regarded John F. Kennedy as very much one of their own. Last night I watched a crowd, estimated at 60,000 people, gather at 1 o'clock in the morning in a torchlight ceremony just 5 hours after the assassination was announced to render homage to the late president. This morning, the West Berlin television system broke into its German-language programming to present Mayor Willy Brandt, telecasting a message in English by satellite to the United States. Along the main streets in Berlin, many shops have placed American flags in their windows. The same flags, in many cases, waved by the people of West Berlin when Mr. Kennedy visited this city 5 months ago. And tonight, Berlin will be filled with candles in most windows in the memory of a friend of Berlin. They have taken his death very hard in this city. John Chancellor, NBC News, Berlin.
John Russ Ward in New York. During the night, was there ever any serious danger of an emotional outburst by perhaps young people in West Berlin, a possible outburst directed toward the wall?
Well, there was originally a certain amount of apprehension about that, Russ, and then I asked Mayor Brandt, and he said that he hadn't believed it would have taken place, and the events of the evening showed that it had not. Actually, at Checkpoint Charlie, one of the apertures in the wall where such a manifestation might have taken place, people turned up to shake the hands of the American guards there in sympathy and condolence for the loss of the president. But aside from that, there was no manifestation that I could determine along the wall last night.
I know reaction from the eastern sector was slow in coming. Do the satellite nations and does East Germany this morning realize the full impact of what has taken place?
Oh, I think yes. The death remained the main topic of conversation and concern, and in most cases personal regret on both sides of the Iron Curtain. It was front-page news in almost all newspapers in the East Bloc, and the newspapers in Moscow, as you know, gave the story remarkably heavy and quite sympathetic coverage. The chief communist mourner this morning was Soviet Premier Khrushchev, who sent messages to President Johnson and to Mrs. Kennedy. The Soviet Premier's wife, Nina Petrovna, also sent a message of condolence to Mrs. Kennedy. Other messages were sent by Soviet President Leonid Brezhnev and Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. And earlier this morning, a grim-looking, very serious-looking Khrushchev went to the residence of the American ambassador to the Soviet Union in Moscow, a place called Spaso House, to pay his personal respects. Now, at Spaso House, the Americans have set up a book in which the Soviet people can write messages of sympathy. And the Soviet premier signed the book and added the date without further comment. But in his telegrams and informal remarks, the Soviet leader spoke of Mr. Kennedy as a man of peace and an outstanding statesman. It's believed, as a matter of fact, that Premier Khrushchev returned to Moscow from the Ukraine, especially to offer his sympathies. And incidentally, he appeared in Moscow for the first time anyone can remember, accompanied by a bodyguard who wore a uniform. Generally, Mr. Khrushchev's bodyguards, as you know, wear civilian dress.
John, the man being held in Dallas, Texas for the assassination of the president is described as one who has professed his love for Russia, who has denounced the capitalist system, and who once even tried to renounce his U.S. citizenship to become a Russian citizen. Have these facts been mentioned in the communist papers in East Germany or elsewhere?
Well, in a very curious way, the only way I could put it, Russ, is that the Russians jumped a little too fast on the pigmentation of Mr. Oswald and drew the ideological conclusion from it, and it flashed through the satellites. When the news came to the communist world last night, the killer was described only as a white man. Now, the Soviet Union first, and then other communist countries, including East Germany, seized on the idea that the killer was acting for right-wing and racist elements in the United States. Now, as we all know, since that time, it has become known that the man charged with the crime once lived in Russia, and therefore the communist propagandists are faced with a very tricky problem. In Czechoslovakia this morning, the official news agency, Jfk'S, carried a commentary which warned that a serious situation could arise if the assassin of the president is identified with the communists. The Czech commentator said that would be dangerous, and I quote, since the right wing in America would have a singularly good chance of taking advantage of the shock of the nation, end quote. Now, that is what they are saying in Czechoslovakia. Of course, the assassin has been linked with the communists, and that being the case, the European communist press is, in my view, likely to just drop this phase of the story rather than keep after it. Needless to say, if it had been the other way around, we would have had a long propaganda bombardment from Moscow and Prague and other communist capitals on the question of the American right wing.
John, a final question. Has there been any talk of a possible change in U.S. foreign policy under the administration of Lyndon Johnson?
No, I think most observers here have not thought a great deal about the future course of American policy under President Johnson, but it's a natural thing to think about. I would say that most of the people I've spoken with feel that in the coming weeks and possibly the coming months, most of the policies will be maintained. The people of Berlin certainly feel that. Mayor Brandt feels that. They do feel that Secretary of State Dean Rusk will play a larger role in the early days of the Johnson administration than he played in the Kennedy administration, working with a very vigorous and forceful and informed president. Not that the new president is not, but it takes time to learn all these things.
John, thank you very much. We'll be in touch with you throughout the day. The new President of the United States, 55-year-old Lyndon B. Johnson. This is the top order of succession to Lyndon Johnson, as established by law in 1947. The Speaker of the House of Representatives, now Democrat John W. McCormick of Massachusetts, first in line should Johnson be unable to serve. The President pro tem of the Senate, now Democratic Senator Carl Hayden of Arizona. Following him, the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk of New York. After that, the Secretary of the Treasury, C. Douglas Dillon of New Jersey. John F. Kennedy, the fourth American president to be killed by assassin's bullets. The first, Abraham Lincoln, shot on April 15, 1865, by Southern sympathizer John Wilkes Booth in the Ford Theater in the city of Washington. James Garfield was gunned down July 2nd, 1881, by Charles J. Guiteau on the Capitol Railroad station as he was setting out on a vacation. William McKinley died September 14th, 1901, shot by an anarchist 8 days earlier. And John F. Kennedy, fatally wounded yesterday by a sniper bullet during a Dallas, Texas motorcade. For reaction now from the Cuban community, here's John Lovacek, NBC News, Miami.
The large Cuban community in Miami, almost 200,000 strong, is shocked and saddened at the assassination of President Kennedy. Even though many Cubans criticized the president because they felt he did not take strong enough action against Fidel Castro, the feeling is universal that his assassination is no answer to their problem of liberating Cuba. Ernesto Frera, whose son was in the Bay of Pigs invasion and who is one of the most respected leaders of the community, told me, "John, there is sadness among the Cubans. We are all deeply shocked." At the Cuban Refugee Center yesterday, many were near hysteria. The telephone operator reported her switchboard was jammed with calls from Cubans asking if the news was true. Cuban maids working in the hotel where the NBC office is located had tears in their eyes as they came to listen to the news. In Cuba itself, Wlw-Radio continues broadcasting the news, reading American news agency dispatches but making no comment. The Cuban government thus far has made no official statement on the death of the president. John Lavacek, NBC News, Miami.
In assuming the responsibilities of the presidency yesterday in Dallas, Lyndon Johnson took the oath of office in the crowded cabin of the presidential jet plane. These are the words of that oath. I do solemnly swear that I will perform the duties of President of the United States to the best of my ability and defend, protect, and preserve the Constitution of the United States, so help me God. The oath administered by U.S. District Court Judge Sarah Hughes, 67 years old and a longtime friend of the Johnson family.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We now pause 10 seconds for station identification.
Wlw-Radio has suspended its regularly scheduled programs during this time of mourning for our late President, John F. Kennedy. We ask you to join with us in prayer for John Kennedy, his bereaved family, and President Lyndon Johnson. This is WLW Cincinnati.
Was taken to the White House early this morning from the Bethesda Naval Hospital, the body to lie in repose throughout the day while friends and government officials pay their respects. In Dallas, Texas, a 24-year-old man, Lee Harvey Oswald, has been charged with murder in the president's assassination. And from around the world, expressions of sorrow and grief at the tragic news. For late developments now from the capital city, Robert McCormick, NBC News, Washington.
Well, Washington faces a leaden and a bitter day. Never has this city been shaken any more badly than it has been by the developments of the last 24 hours. It has now the unhappy job of making sure the government gets back into high gear, for it must go on no matter what happens. President Johnson will, of course, have a series of conferences at the White House today with his leaders, and determinations will be made on what programs should be held up until he can review them, what programs should be pursued with the same speed they have been in the past. The whole country, of course, has a respect for the presidency, but in Washington it naturally is especially strong. The job is almost revered. The person can be criticized, but his position is always respected. And in this case, people in Washington feel that they've not only lost a beloved person, but they have as well watched the position suffer a ghastly indignity. And along that line, let's check now with the White House directly with Robert Goralski.
Well, Bob, in most ways, the White House looks as it does most fall mornings. The only real indications that a slain president lies inside are the extra policemen who've been detailed to take care of the large crowds that are expected during the day, and the flag atop the White House, which is limply flying at half-mast. There are few people outside of the moment. It's been raining off and on, but more are expected. President Johnson is due to arrive at the Executive Office building directly across the street from the White House within the hour, perhaps in about 20 or 25 minutes. Of course, he spent the night at his home in northwest Washington, from where he went last night after a meeting with congressional leaders and a conference with Secretary of Defense McNamara on defense matters. In a little more than an hour and a half from now, members of the late president's family will file into the East Room of the White House, and there John Fitzgerald Kennedy lies in repose. The flag-draped casket containing the body of the late president was returned to the White House early this morning. A Navy ambulance brought the casket from the Bethesda Naval Hospital. The family of Mr. Kennedy will be the first persons to view the body in repose. They'll be followed by President Johnson at 11 o'clock and members of the Cabinet and Congress, the Supreme Court, the Diplomatic Corps. Tomorrow afternoon at 1 o'clock, the body will be carried in a cortege to the rotunda of the Capitol building, 2 miles east on Pennsylvania Avenue. This morning at 9:30, Mr. Johnson will discuss foreign relations with Secretary of State Dean Rusk. 2 hours after that, Mr. Johnson will receive former President Dwight Eisenhower. This afternoon, the members of the Cabinet will confer with Mr. Johnson. All these meetings will be held in the second-floor offices of the Executive Office building, which the President is using for the time being, presumably until after the burial, now scheduled for perhaps Monday afternoon, although it's not been announced officially. And that, Bob, is the story here at the White House.
Well, thank you, Robert. Would you stay with us, please, for just a moment? So far as Congress is concerned, Senate Republican leader Dirksen told us yesterday that in view of the fact that the government has had to break stride because of the catastrophe that's hit us, that Congress may adjourn a few days earlier than the December 20th date that had previously been set, and the reconvening of Congress for the second session of the 88th Congress may be delayed a few days or a week or 10 days beyond the scheduled opening of January 3rd. But other than that, within a few days, the city must get back to what passes for a routine. The scars that have been left on the government, of course, probably will never be eliminated. The Marine Corps here has produced the record of Lee Oswald, the man who's been charged with the assassination of the president. It shows that while he was stationed in Japan, he was court-martialed twice. First, for failure to register a personal weapon, and then a few months later, he was convicted at a court-martial for using provocative language to a non-commissioned officer. He, of course, is the man who also has expressed sympathy for the communist government. Russ Ward, did you want to come in on this? Are you there, Russ Ward? While we wait for...
Yes, we're right here, Robert.
Oh. I understood you wanted to talk to me or to Goralski, did you?
I wanted to get some reaction from you, Robert, on the city of Washington. Of course, government offices are closed today. It's my understanding they did close early yesterday. Is that correct?
Yes, they did. Producing a monumental traffic jam. I don't say that in a facetious way at all, but largely because as the drivers heading out into Virginia and Maryland passed the White House, they sort of involuntarily slowed down, not to stare as tourists really, but just sort of in an involuntary gesture of respect. And I think I see my good friend Hubert Humphrey coming in here now, Rust, and we'd like to talk to him if we can. Good morning. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning.
Senator, I'm very happy indeed to see you, and I was with you yesterday for a while. I know how deeply this has affected you. Would you mind telling us something of your ideas now, either on what has happened or what will happen? I should explain Senator Humphrey is the Democratic whip of the Senate, works under Senator Mike Mansfield, the Democratic leader.
Well, Bob, that I'm still somewhat in a state of, of confusion and of such deep concern and shock that I haven't been able to really get myself functioning like I would like to. This is a real fact and one that's very troublesome. I was at the, Mrs. Humphrey and I should say, were at the Chilean embassy yesterday for a luncheon. By the way, I don't believe I've accepted one lunch in years to be away from the capital at noontime, but the Chilean ambassador is a very kind and gracious man, and he'd been to my home state of Minnesota, and I thought I ought to reciprocate and at least accept an invitation, and I was there with Ralph Dungan and others at Mr. Dungan being the late President Kennedy's assistant. And the news came to us that the president had been shot, at that time wounded, and of course, like others, we hoped and prayed that the wound wasn't as serious as the first news reports indicated. And of course, I received a telephone call from the White House, and I was told that the president had passed away, that he'd been killed. I then, all at once, it dawned on me that the closeness of relationship, this is something that I've been reflecting upon. I'd worked with President Kennedy, and I'd been a colleague of his in the Senate, and as we all know, I'd been a contestant with him in the primaries, and then I became a lieutenant of the president's in the legislative program, and I worked very closely with him and had a very friendly and warm personal relationship. But when that news came that he had been taken from us, that he'd been shot, I stood alone in the hallway of the embassy, and I'm not ashamed to say I just couldn't contain myself. I just broke down and sobbed because it seemed like a bit of life had gone right out of me. And then to try to tell others to come to the table and to tell the guests and the host that we'd lost our president was a very, very difficult assignment. And so during that day of yesterday and this morning, it just seems like it's not reality. I keep hoping that somehow or another that this is one of those moments that just isn't true, that it's unreal, that it's an ugly dream. But of course it is real. We have to face up to it. Mrs. Humphrey and I were at the airport at Andrews Air Base last night when the president's body was brought back. I still see my old friend and the president's intimate personal friend, Dave Powers, there with his beloved friend, President Kennedy, and Larry O'Brien, Kenny O'Donnell, these wonderful men that worked with President Kennedy. And they were there with him to the very last moment. They were there as they tenderly and lovingly brought his body back to the nation's capital. And then I saw Mrs. Humphrey and I saw Mrs. Kennedy. That poor lady, what she has gone through, losing her baby and now her husband, and yet the strength and the poise that she demonstrates is an inspiration to all of us. I haven't had a chance to see her yet. Mrs. Humphrey hasn't. But I know that she realizes, knows that we really are with her in spirit and in prayer and in sympathy. So we later on during the night moved to see the new president, President Johnson. I want to say a word about that, Bob. Is it all right just to
very much
go on and talk to you about it?
Yes.
All during my service in the Senate, I've been a close friend of President Lyndon Johnson. You know, it's very difficult to change terminology because I've always thought of President Johnson as Lyndon. But now it's President Johnson. And I know of his sterling qualities of leadership and his unique ability to perform the art of politics. He really is a competent tactician, a leader, born leader. He loves public service. But I want to say one other thing about him. I watched him as the companion and the supporting arm of President Kennedy, our late and beloved President Kennedy, and he was intensely loyal to President Kennedy. Even when there were little things said that could appear to divide them, he never let that happen, nor did President Kennedy let that happen. I was with them morning after morning at breakfast, as you know. Every Tuesday morning we'd have breakfast at the White House. I sat right next to President Johnson as the vice president then, and right across the table from the president. I know the exchanges that took place. I've kept little notes of this. And the warmth of feeling, the friendliness that was there, and the give and the take, the good humor, and yet also the seriousness of purpose. I was there, I know, you see. I literally rubbed arms with the vice president, now the president, and looked right into the eyes of the president, right across the table, President Kennedy. And I want to say now, so that there can never be any doubt about it, that the loyalty, the faithfulness to the man that Vice President Johnson at that time had to President Kennedy was beyond doubt. It was marvelous. He was dedicated to him. And the Vice President was dedicated to President Kennedy's program, and he will continue to be. I happen to know that he will consider one of the memorials that we can leave or can give to President Kennedy is the fulfillment of President Kennedy's program, because this is the living memorial. I watched Vice President Johnson, as Vice President, I should say, go to great limits, almost beyond his strength, to fulfill tasks for President Kennedy then. So this spirit of understanding and friendship must be clearly understood in the American public, and I think it is. And I want our friends overseas to know, too, that in President Johnson, you have one who worked alongside of President Kennedy. You had one that is dedicated to the same program, to the same international commitments, to the love of this republic, to the love of freedom, political freedom, all the freedoms. And I must say that while our forefathers had such foresight in giving us a political system where there can be a transfer of power without the contest for power, without a struggle for power, where we have political institutions that can endure almost any kind of pain and crisis, that God Almighty has been very good to us too. We have men that are trained for these jobs. And in America with Lyndon Johnson, the President of the United States now, we have a man that is trained for the job, that is an experienced leader, that is dedicated to political life and to the principles of democracy. We're fortunate, very, very fortunate.
Thank you very much, Senator, and perhaps you'd like to stay for just a moment because I'm going to switch to Peter Jfk'S out at President Johnson's home, Les Ormes. Peter, are you there?
President Lyndon Johnson has just left his home here in northwest Washington on a 10 or 12-minute ride downtown to the Executive Office building. There were 3 cars. The first one was the Secret Service car called affectionately the Queen Mary. Then came the President's car. He was seated in the rear seat on the right next to the window. As I saw him when he pulled out of the driveway, his face was drawn in a rather determined look. There were a number of other officials inside the car. Behind that was another Secret Service car, and the entire 3-car motorcade was surrounded by 6 or 7 Washington, D.C. motorcycle policemen. The crowd outside the home of Mr. Johnson thinned out for a while when it started to drizzle. Then the rain stopped, and I would say there were about 50 people here when he left this morning. He's on his way now down to his usual office in the Executive Office building, which is located directly next door to the White House. His first meeting today will be with Secretary of State Rusk for breakfast. Later on this morning, President Johnson and his family and some top officials of the new Johnson government are expected to view the body of the late President Kennedy as it lies in repose in the East Room of the White House. As you may have heard, Mr. Johnson has asked the full Kennedy cabinet to stay on. So as of this moment, Lyndon Baines Johnson has left his home for his first day of duty as the nation's 36th president. This is Peter Jfk'S, NBC News, outside the Johnson home in Washington.
This is Russ Ward in the NBC Newsroom in New York as we continue our coverage of the tragic events surrounding the death of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. As you have heard, the body of the nation's 35th president is now in repose this morning in the East Room of the White House. It was taken there early this morning from the Bethesda, Maryland Naval Hospital. Throughout the day, the president's family, his close friends, and top officials of the United States government will view the body. Tomorrow, it will be borne by solemn cortege to the rotunda of the Capitol, where it will lie in state for 24 hours and be viewed by the public. Funeral services to be held at noon Monday at St. Matthew's Roman Catholic Cathedral in Washington. The final resting place for the 46-year-old president still uncertain at this time. Robert McCormick, if you are in our Washington newsroom, may I ask if you have any details on plans for U.S. government offices for Monday, schools, offices? How will the city of Washington pay tribute on the day of the president's funeral?
To the best of my knowledge, there's been no formal announcement about it yet, but I assume that I'm quite sure that the government employees will be allowed to pay their respects to the president at the Capitol as he lies in state and as the cortege goes from the White House to the Capitol. Senator Humphrey, have you heard anything about that by any chance?
No, I have not, but I'm confident that an appropriate announcement will be made very shortly, and all of the arrangements will be properly outlined. Bob, last night as I sat in my office and after visiting with President Johnson, as you recall, a number of the congressional leaders were at President Johnson's office for about 45 minutes, where we had a very intimate, personal talk with the new president pledging our loyalty and our support and our helpfulness. I went back to my own office. I just sort of wanted to be alone a little while. And while I was there, the phones kept ringing. I had no secretarial staff there because I had asked them to go to their respective homes. My office people knew President Kennedy, and they were terribly upset with this tragic loss. Those phones kept ringing in about, and they were all long-distance calls from back out in Minnesota, practically all of them. One or two other calls from friends of mine, New York and Chicago. And without exception, the calls were filled with love for the late president, and with grief, with sadness. I remember the final call that I took just before I went to my own home here in Chevy Chase, Maryland, was from a gentleman who was a taxi cab driver out in St. Paul. He had just finished work, and he'd gotten home, and he called up, wanted me to know how he felt and how his family felt. And he wanted me to tell the family of President Kennedy how he and his family grieved for them. You know, this is the kind of thing that I think tells the story of love and affection for a man, more so than even headlines or anything that those of us in public life can say. And I just went home filled with emotion because of not only the day, but because of what people had told me, just folks that I know back home.
We are accustomed here to considering the president as the man next door, as our neighbor. We have a much warmer, much closer feeling to them, we always thought, than people around the country. But from what you say, that may not be true. Perhaps President Kennedy was the man next door to everyone.
I think that's very true, and also I sometimes feel that in the expression of freedom which we have in America, in this very free freedom that we have, that sometimes we give people the feeling that there isn't much respect for public office or even for the high office of presidency. But you know, when the moment of crisis comes, like as it did in the Cuban crisis, or when a moment of tragedy comes as it did yesterday when President Kennedy was taken from us, then all at once you see the American people as they really are, a thoughtful people, a considerate people, an emotional people, and a warm and friendly people, and their love for their president is genuine and sincere, very, very much. I remember when President Roosevelt passed away, and I remember then the feeling of loneliness and of personal loss. And I can remember when President Eisenhower was stricken with a heart attack, and I remember the feeling of concern that came across the whole nation. And now I have witnessed this deep personal feeling that people have about our beloved late President Kennedy. And I can honestly tell you, Bob, that when I got the news, I felt that just a part of my life had left me. As I said, I didn't even know I felt that way. That's really the truth. I knew I thought a great deal of the president, and my relationships were extremely cordial. In fact, just Wednesday of this week, we were joking and having a great time. I was walking with him over to the White House and in the garden, and having a wonderful, wonderful visit, just like two friends would have. But then all at once, when a terrible moment of tragedy comes and death takes your friend, then you realize that something is gone. Well, we articulate fellows find no words to really explain it.
And yet, with all of that, Senator Humphrey, as you said about President Johnson, when he steps into the job, he no longer is Lyndon, he's Mr. President.
That's right, and he takes on entirely new responsibilities, and in a sense, he becomes a new person. I know that he will become a fine president. And I say this with all respect and with great respect for the one that has departed, that President Johnson has fine and great qualities of national leadership, of leadership for this nation. And the people throughout the world should literally be prayerfully grateful that out of the plain folk of this country comes a man that is so extremely well qualified for public service and for leadership as President Johnson. And I look forward to working with him. I literally held his hand last night and pledged my personal as well as public support to his efforts, because I know he needs it. Believe me, he needs it in this job.
And you are one of those who has the extremely trying task of keeping the government going at a time when actually you don't feel like going much yourself.
That's about right. Well, we'll keep the government going, and we have jobs to do and work to do, and a brave people in a big country and a strong country must be able to not only to express its sorrow and its sympathy and its love and affection, but it must also stand strong and carry on. And I know that the greatest tribute, the greatest memorial that we could give to the memory of President Kennedy is to carry out what he started out to do. And he did so many great things. He revitalized our national power, and he brought to us a new respect throughout the world. He contributed so much to the cause of peace, and he has worked so hard for human dignity and human rights. All of these pledges and promises and all of these beginnings now we must continue. And I'm sure that we're going to be able to do that because we have a continuity of leadership. Isn't that marvelous that we have a continuity of policy, philosophy, and of program? I think this bodes well for the nation.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Humphrey, and thanks for coming up here, and thanks for a very revealing insight on something most of us really haven't had time to think about, had neither the time nor the will to think about.
Robert and Senator Humphrey, allow me to interrupt just a moment. Newspapers abroad this morning are likening this tragedy to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, in that both Lincoln and President Kennedy were fighters for civil rights. And knowing Senator Humphrey's feelings about civil rights, about equal rights for all, I wonder if he would comment on what this may mean to the President's civil rights program.
Well, you know, just as you were speaking, I was saying to Bob McCormick here that I was racing through my mind the very same thought, that this is 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. This is the Emancipation year, so to speak, centennial. And President Kennedy has taken such a brave and noble position on the issue of human rights. Not a position that was radical or that was extreme, but one that was within the spirit of the Constitution and within the spirit of our philosophy of life and of our democratic way of life. And I'm sure you realize and recognize with me that the then Vice President and now President Johnson was one of the most brilliant and one of the most dedicated and sincere spokesmen these years of President Kennedy's administration for the doctrine of human rights and for civil rights. It is most interesting to me to see how this man from Texas really stood up on this great and fundamental issue of our time of human rights. I remember President Johnson's speech at Gettysburg. I believe it was right around the 4th of July, as I recall. I placed that speech in the record. I was going to place it in the record, and someone beat me to it in the Congressional record, as I recall, someone there first. But that was a remarkable speech. I want to get that out and read it once again, because I was inspired by it at the time that I read it. This is the speech of President Johnson's in 1963. It was in the spirit, really, of the Gettysburg Address of Abraham Lincoln. And both of these great emancipators, Abraham Lincoln and President Kennedy, were taken from us by the assassin's bullet. And as you may recall, President Lincoln was succeeded by President Johnson. Yes, and President Johnson was a border state man, as I recall, from Tennessee. And he tried to carry out the policy of reconciliation with the South of Abraham Lincoln. And here is President Kennedy being succeeded by President Johnson from Texas.
In a situation that
very much the same.
Very much the same. Haven't we overlooked the fact that President Johnson had a great deal of the responsibility for getting through the last Civil Rights Act, the first one we'd had since Reconstruction days in 58, I think it was, wasn't it?
I should say so. The first major piece of civil rights legislation to pass in over 80 years was passed under the leadership of President Johnson. And I want to say one other thing. Well, that's when President Johnson was majority leader in the Senate. He worked closely with the Republican president. I think we ought to understand that while we have our party differences in this country, that I've never known a responsible leader in America that didn't put his country above his party. And the warmth of friendship and the closeness of relationship between the former President Eisenhower and now President Johnson is a matter of record in history and is a living fact today. And what a great thing this is, because President Johnson can draw upon the experience of President Eisenhower and President Truman. President Truman was a warm and intimate friend, and is today, of President Johnson. And all of these great men who have given so much to their country, including President Hoover, who is a man that is in years now, they can all give so much now to our new president in advice.
Well, thank you once again, Senator Humphrey. And everything you say was quite correct. And so now I think we'll give you a rest and go back to Russ Ward in New York.
Thank you, Robert, and thanks, too, to Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota. The body of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, now in repose at the White House, to be viewed today by close friends and government officials, tomorrow to be taken to the rotunda of the Capitol, where it will lie in state for 24 hours and be viewed by the public.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We now pause 10 seconds for station identification.
Wlw-Radio joins its listeners in an expression of deep sorrow on the death of our President. This is WLW, Cincinnati.
Messages of sympathy and condolence continue to come in from all parts of the world, both to the people of the United States and to the immediate family of the late John F. Kennedy. For more on this story, we go to Irving R. Levine in Rome.
Pope Paul VI sent messages of sympathy to members of the Kennedy family today. Radiograms went from the Vatican to the deceased president's wife, parents, and brother, Robert Kennedy. The Pope also has dispatched messages to President Lyndon Johnson and to Cardinal Cushing of Boston, a friend of the Kennedy family. Pope Paul's cable to Jacqueline Kennedy read, "I hasten to send to you, beloved daughter, the assurances of our heartfelt sympathy on the deep sorrow and of our fervent prayers for the eternal repose of the soul of your husband." The Vatican message to President Johnson included these papal words, "To your excellency and to the beloved American people, we offer the expression of our sincerest prayerful condolences on the death, in particularly tragic circumstances, of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, whom we had known personally and whose intrepid character and high qualities we admired." Those were Pope Paul's words. Irving R. Levine, NBC News, Rome.
Late developments from Washington now as we go to Robert McCormick.
And I shan't delay us. We will switch immediately to Robert Goralski at the White House.
Newsmen have just been permitted in the East Room of the White House, and there the body of President Kennedy lies in a casket. No part of the late president is visible. The casket is completely covered by an American flag. At the corners of the flag-draped casket are members of the armed services who form a four-man guard of honor. There is a single floral bouquet in front of the president's casket made up of mixed white flowers. President's body lies from north to south. There are two flags directly behind the casket, the flag of the United States and the presidential flag. There are two priests of the Roman Catholic Church who are kneeling on the west side of the East Room. They are kneeling, praying for President Kennedy. There's the black crepe hangs over and around the door of the White House under the north portico, and in just 57 minutes from now, members of the presidential family will file past the casket of President Kennedy in the East Room. This will continue until 6 o'clock this evening. President Johnson will arrive here at 11 o'clock. This is Robert Goralski, NBC News at the White House.
And in that somber surrounding, President Johnson still must go ahead with his work as best he can. There are three main considerations, of course, in President Johnson's future policies. One is foreign affairs. He's expected to follow very closely the late President Kennedy's approach. Second will be civil rights, and as you heard from Senator Humphrey, he is dedicated to the civil rights program, undoubtedly will pursue that with the same vigor that the late president did. On the subject of taxes and minor matters of politics, Senator Johnson has not declared himself quite so clearly, but there's little doubt in the minds of most people in Washington that at least for an appreciable time, our formal official policies will not alter. In the meantime, there is a feeling here that politics and legislative work must take something of a breather so the 535 members of Congress can recover from the shock and can collect themselves sufficiently to proceed in an orderly manner. And in that connection, I believe we've told you that the Congress may adjourn a week earlier than the December 20th date that had previously been set, and it may delay by a few days or a week or 10 days the reconvening of the second session of the 88th Congress. But there can be no question at all that in spite of their grief, which is very, very real, and their sadness, which is equally solid and substantial to the people of Washington, completely regardless of politics, and in spite of these things, they must go on. They cannot falter now at all. Of course, President Johnson has the problem now of delegating some of his immediate and personal responsibilities to men of his own choosing, the personal representatives of the president, so to speak. These are not political appointees, they're personal appointees, personal choices. The new President Johnson has his own family of advisors who've been with him for many, many years, and it's assumed that a good many of these will move into the White House with him. However, their influence on policy will be less pronounced than their influence on the administration of policy. It seems likely that as we go along, there will be changes because what is called the president's family, the heads of agencies and departments reporting directly to him, in addition to his personal staff, those jobs are considered those sort of alter egos of the president, and they must reflect in some detail the president's own thinking and feeling and the president's own tactics and approaches to problems. So we will see changes in Washington. They probably will be gradual. We have no idea of how sweeping they will be, but the fundamental policies, it would seem now, will change very little. President Johnson has had considerable experience, of course, in foreign affairs, more than most vice presidents have had the opportunity to accumulate, and he is extremely well informed on such things as foreign aid, as we discovered when a foreign aid authorization bill was pending in Congress, finally was partially cleared last week. President Johnson, on occasion, spoke up on behalf of one program or another connected with foreign aid, and he had a rather astonishing grasp of the detail, knew more than some of the correspondents who have followed the program with meticulous care. And now, I'd like to go back to Robert Goralski at the White House. Robert, are you there?
Yes, I am, Bob.
What is happening over there now, Robert?
Well, President Johnson arrived here about 12 minutes ago. Instead of going over to the Executive Office building, as everyone had anticipated, he went directly into the White House, where he will apparently establish his headquarters. This hadn't been expected until sometime next week after the burial of President Kennedy. About 2 minutes ago, the Director of Central Intelligence, John McCone, and McGeorge Bundy, who was the advisor to President Kennedy on national security affairs, entered the White House together, presumably to discuss with President Johnson international affairs and defense matters.
What otherwise have any other members of the president's, the late president's personal family, have they showed up yet?
Not yet, Bob. They're expected here shortly before 10 o'clock, as I mentioned before. From 10 until 11 o'clock, the members of the late president's family will file into the East Room of the White House, and there they will see the president's body lying in repose under that flag-draped casket. But so far, there have been no members of the president's family who have arrived here. I would assume that Attorney General Robert Kennedy, of course the member of the cabinet, will be in conference with President Johnson immediately after the family has gone into the East Room, prior to the full cabinet meeting that President Johnson has scheduled for sometime this afternoon. We expect former President Eisenhower to arrive here about 10:30, quarter to 11. And the other president, I did not mention him before, who will be in Washington, is Harry Truman, but Mr. Truman is not expected until tomorrow. And as had been announced late last night, the other former living president, Herbert Hoover, is 89 years old and is in ailing health in New York. He has expressed his regrets that he will not be able to be in Washington during this period of mourning.
Robert, Senator Humphrey spoke just a little bit ago about the courage and the extreme fortitude with which Mrs. Kennedy has handled this thing. The whole country, as we've learned from telephone calls and other ways, it comes as no surprise to us, is terribly concerned about the personal aspects of this tragedy, and it's the only reason I ask you a question like this. Have you heard anything about the Kennedy children at all?
No, we haven't. I think this has been in keeping with Mrs. Kennedy's desires, and that is that the children play no prominent part in the publicity that surrounds the presidency. And in a time of grief such as this, of course, her wishes are certainly going to be honored. And there's been no effort to find out in more detail where the children are. And as of this morning, so far as I know, they still have not been told about the death of their father. This is the latest information I have. Now, it's entirely possible that Mrs. Kennedy, when she did meet with the children, I presume she has by now, has told them the very, very sad news. But there's been no press, certainly, to find out these details. I think that everyone is honoring Mrs. Kennedy's known desires, that they not be given any publicity, that this is a time of grief, and we should not intrude on their privacy. And I think we all realize that, and there's this great empathy for her in this moment of crisis and great anguish that she is suffering.
Well, certainly no one wants to penetrate that. As Senate Republican leader Dirksen told us yesterday, this is a moment for private grief. But unfortunately, in this case, it is the nation's grief and the world's grief as well.
We still don't know if any of the international conferences that President Kennedy had scheduled and had been contemplating will be followed through by President Johnson. Of course, the most immediate one is the meeting here scheduled for next week with German Chancellor Ludwig Erhard. So far as I know, maybe you have more information, Bob. I believe that the Chancellor is still scheduled to arrive here on the 24th, but I doubt very much if he would come to Washington at this time.
Well, and yet, on the other hand, as we've said so often before this morning, the government must go on.
Yes, that is true. That is true.
Someone has to do it. It can't be allowed to falter, even for a few moments.
There might well be a postponement, not necessarily a cancellation, but in some other way, President Johnson could see Chancellor Erhard perhaps at a later date. There will be a reshufflement, I'm sure, of dates and the scheduled appearances here in Washington by the Chancellor. And, of course, we have the other Western meeting that had been talked about but had not been announced officially. That is a conference between President Kennedy and British Prime Minister Sir Alec Douglas-Home. There's no indication of when this would be, but presumably sometime around the Christmas holidays, and I would imagine that one of the first things that President Johnson would do was to review foreign policy matters and matters of common interest with the British Prime Minister.
Yes, the new president has a great deal of work to do. We'll be back to you in a short time, Robert, I hope. But now we go back to Russ Ward in New York.
Governor Nelson Rockefeller has proclaimed a 30-day mourning period here in the state of New York. Rockefeller, the candidate for the Republican presidential nomination, a weekend campaign trip he was planning to make in New Hampshire. In Britain, the royal court went into mourning for a one-week period. The tenor bell of Westminster Abbey was to toll 60 times in mourning today. This is a tribute normally paid only to a deceased member of the royal family. This indicating the extent of British feeling to this tragedy that has struck the president's family. Other reaction from abroad now is we hear from Bernard Frizzell in Paris.
Frenchmen, from sophisticated officials at the Foreign Office to the simple people of Paris, today expressed their profound shock at the death of President Kennedy. The reactions are completely spontaneous and range from President de Gaulle's deeply emotional message to Mrs. Kennedy, expressing his immense grief, to the unaffected compassion of a concierge calling the dead president le pauvre, the poor man. Even the French Communist Party called the assassination odious. The people of France are displaying an unprecedented affection for a foreign statesman and a touching sympathy for individual Americans. Whatever the differences in French and American policies, the French reaction is a testimony to France's sympathy and friendship for the United States. This is Bernard Frizzell, NBC News, Paris.
From the Vatican City now, the actual voice of Pope Paul VI as he expresses sympathies to the people of the United States.
We are deeply shocked by this sad and tragic news of the killing of the President of the United States of America, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and the serious wounding of Governor Connley. And we are profoundly saddened by so dastardly a crime, by the mourning which afflicts a great and civilized country in its head, by the suffering which strikes at Mrs. Kennedy, her children, and the family. With all our heart, we deplore this unhappy event. We express the heartfelt wish that the death of this great statesman may not damage the cause of the American people, but rather reinforce its moral and civil sentiments and strengthen its feelings of nobility and concord. And we pray to God that the sacrifice of John Kennedy may be made to favor the cause he promoted and to help defend the freedom of peoples and peace in the world. He was the first Catholic president of the United States. We recall our pleasure in receiving its visit and in having discerned in him great wisdom and high resolution for the good of humanity. Tomorrow we shall offer the holy sacrifice of the Mass, that God may grant him eternal rest, that he may comfort and console all those who weep for him in his death, and in order that not hatred but Christian love should reign among all mankind.
The voice of Pope Paul VI and his message to the people of the United States. From the Soviet capital, Premier Khrushchev has cabled a message of condolence to Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy. And this is the way it reads. It was with deep personal grief that I learned about the tragic death of your husband, President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. All people who knew him greatly respected him, and I shall always keep the memory of my meetings with him. Accept my most sincere condolences and expressions of wholehearted sympathy with your grievous bereavement. The Soviet news agency TASS said Mrs. Nina Khrushchev, the Premier's wife, also sent a telegram to Mrs. Kennedy. The text of it, shocked by the tragic death of your husband, the President of the United States of America, John F. Kennedy, I ask you to accept this sorrowful hour my sincere condolences and sympathy with you and your entire family. Messages from Russia's Premier Khrushchev and Mrs. Khrushchev. Mrs. Rose Kennedy, the former president's mother, went to 2 masses at St. Francis Xavier Church today at Hyannisport, then returned home to the sad task of telling her husband that their son had been assassinated in Dallas, Texas yesterday. She was dressed entirely in black as she arrived at the church at 7 o'clock this morning. She was later joined by Miss Ann Gargan, the niece of former Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy. Mrs. Rose Kennedy spoke with newsmen for a moment as she left the church. She said, "I came to the early mass so I could go home and have breakfast with my husband. He has not yet been advised." The president's 75-year-old father suffered a stroke in December of 1960 and has not yet fully recovered. The family is keeping the news from him until today. Senator Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts and his sister, Mrs. Eunice Shriver, the wife of Peace Corps Director Sergeant Shriver, also attended Mass this morning, arriving there shortly after Mrs. Rose Kennedy. They sat in a pew across from her and spoke with her briefly. The late president's 73-year-old mother was met at the door of the church by the pastor, the Right Reverend Leonard Daly. He offered his sympathy and then went to the altar to celebrate the Mass. The family of President Kennedy has asked that no flowers be sent for the funeral services. An announcement issued by the White House said the Kennedy family has expressed the desire that no flowers be sent to the White House for the funeral. They ask that anyone wishing to do so donate an equivalent amount to charity. Once again, the body of the late President John F. Kennedy lies in repose this morning in the East Room of the White House. It was borne there early today from the Bethesda Naval Hospital in nearby Maryland. Throughout the day, the president's family, his close friends, and high government officials will view the body. Tomorrow, it will be borne by solemn cortege to the rotunda of the Capitol, where it will lie in state for 24 hours to be viewed by the public. Funeral services to be held at noon Monday at St. Matthew's Roman Catholic Cathedral in Washington. The final resting place for the 46-year-old president still to be announced. Lyndon Johnson starting out his first full day as the nation's 36th president. He's meeting with Secretary of State Dean Rusk, with former President Eisenhower, with members of his cabinet and other high-ranking government officials. In Dallas, Texas, a 24-year-old admitted Russian sympathizer, Lee Harvey Oswald, has been charged with murder in the killing of the president. Late last night, authorities charged Oswald with firing the shot that took Mr. Kennedy's life. Oswald professes his innocence, says he did not kill the president or anyone else. Now, if Robert McCormick is with us in the Washington studio, we ask him for late developments from there. We'll be back to Robert McCormick momentarily. We might mention that Jim Haggerty, former press secretary of Dwight Eisenhower, says there were 2 plots against the life of Mr. Eisenhower while he was in office, both traced to the Nationalist Party of Puerto Rico, the same group accused in the abortive attempt on the life of President Truman. Back in the spring of 1958, Secret Service agents learned an attempt would be made to toss grenades into Mr. Eisenhower's car during a trip through a Midwestern city. The second plan, as Haggerty outlines it, was reported to the Secret Service in the spring of 1959. Neither attempt came off, and no one was arrested in either of the plots. Now we go to Robert McCormick in the NBC newsroom in Washington.
I was here, Russ. I was just a little slow in answering you before. I didn't want you to think I was shirking. Russ, one of the amazing things here is the fact that the streets downtown, I've been told by one police officer, all night long had more people on them by far than they usually do, especially, of course, around the White House. The White House crowds were not large, but there was always a cluster of people there, and they just stood outside in the dark, and it was a very humid sort of night, and milled around. They weren't quite sure why they were there, but on the other hand, they were sure that they didn't want to go to bed, didn't want just to go home and try to pretend that nothing had happened. But also, I'm told, there were people not in crowds, but individually walking around the Capitol building during the course of the evening. One of the things that's been lost sight of here was the effect this rather dreadful thing had on Congress. The word got to the Senate, where I was, very quickly through the news circuits, and it was just as though the members had been kicked in the stomach. It was just one of the most terrible things I've ever seen. They just sat around. They couldn't seem to move at all. And just coming into the studio here are three estimable gentlemen. Senator Jack Tower of Texas. Jack, how are you? And Congressman Hale Boggs, the whip of the House, and Representative Jerry Ford of Michigan. And as soon as we get them distributed here, I would like to talk to them. Do we have time, Russ?
Yes, you do, Robert. Go right ahead.
Well, let's begin with you, Senator Tower, because of the location of this tragedy. You have a rather direct interest in it. What is your feeling about what happened?
Well, of course, I'm shocked, as is every American citizen. Although I was a rather consistent opponent of the president's program, I had a very high respect for him, and of course the same sense of loyalty that all Americans have to their president. And I'm deeply grieved at this cowardly and dastardly act that took from us the President of the United States.
Well, I couldn't help but think it was unfortunate that this happened in Texas, because it is so contrary. Of course, it's contrary to the whole spirit of all 50 states. But Texas particularly, that is so open-hearted in its hospitality, usually, with a couple of regrettable recent exceptions before the president was assassinated.
As a matter of fact, Bob, I think they said this is one of the warmest receptions that the president had in any of his travels over the country. The reception that he had in Texas.
We've been told that Mrs. Connley, the wife of the governor, had just turned around and said something to the effect that you must admit Dallas is very warm in its greeting today, or some such thing.
It is a friendly city.
And it normally is, of course, no blame whatever attaches either to the state or the city, but it is unfortunate that it had to happen at all. Congressman Boggs, you were very close to the president. This must have been particularly hard for you, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, Bob. I still am like so many other Americans, find myself not believing it altogether. I was with Speaker McCormick most of the afternoon yesterday, and various members would come in, and Congressman Albert, the majority leader, and former Speaker Martin, and Minority Leader Halleck, and many others. And I found most of us unable to believe it, particularly the Speaker, who is now second in the line of succession under the laws of our country. But of course it has happened, and we have to turn to the affairs of government and unite our country. The new president, President Johnson, last night, in meeting with the bipartisan leaders of Congress, or the leaders of both parties, I should say, stressed the fact that in periods of strain such as this, that it's vital that we move together as much as we possibly can. And this is a great strain on the American system. The one thing that never crosses our mind is that we shall assassinate a public official. In other lands, in other places, this must always live with a man in public office. But I'm sure it's never crossed the mind of Senator Tower, who is a United States Senator, or Gerald Ford, who is a Congressman of the United States, a representative of the United States, and it's never crossed my mind. And I know that it seldom, if ever, crossed the mind of President Kennedy. He looked upon security measures as sort of an unnecessary thing. And incidentally, I might say to you that Speaker McCormick, who is now second in line, as I said a moment ago, one of his first reactions yesterday was, why is this Secret Service man in here? And all the way out to the airport to meet the body of the president, he was complaining about it, and I finally said, Mr. Speaker, it won't do you any good to complain. They'll be with you now as long as you're in this position.
Well, I'm sure he would resent that. But I'd like to interrupt for just a moment, if I could, if you three gentlemen would just stay here for a moment. We've got to go back to Russ Ward in New York.
Thank you, Robert. We'll continue with this continuous coverage of the events and the reaction from around the world on the death of John F. Kennedy.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We now pause 10 seconds for station identification.
Wlw-Radio and the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation join its listeners in an expression of deep sorrow on the death of our President.
As the city of Washington and the rest of the nation and the world mourn the death of John F. Kennedy, the city of Dallas, Texas, keeps a close eye on what is regarded as the man responsible for the assassination of the president, a 24-year-old who has been charged with murder but who professes his innocence. More on this phase of the story now as we go to Pierce Allman, station WFAA in Dallas.
Lee Oswald, this morning, is still in Dallas County Jail, being held without bond. He still protests his innocence, although District Attorney Henry Wade says he has enough conclusive evidence to ask for capital punishment in the event he is found guilty when he's tried here in Texas in criminal district court. Governor John Connley, Russ, is in Parkland Hospital this morning. He's under heavy sedation. He lapses in and out of consciousness and asks for the Texas Department of Public Safety. Some friends have been at the governor's bedside and have told him that he himself is in pretty good shape now. They have not yet told him of the fate of President Kennedy. Actually, it was sheer luck that Connley escaped. This man was a marksman, evidently, because if Connley had not turned, why, he would have been shot in the heart instead of through the back. The town is incensed this morning, but still stunned. Everyone says the same 4 words over and over, and most say it with the same tone. It's this blank look, and I can't believe it.
Pierce, can you tell us if Governor Connley is aware of the death of the president?
No, he's not, Russ. He hasn't been told of the death of the president yet. He has been under sedation. And an interesting note, we learned from Washington a few moments ago that Republican Representative Alger and Republican Senator John Tower, moments after the death notice of Mr. Kennedy yesterday afternoon, began receiving highly abusive telephone calls and decided to go to the homes of friends temporarily. And the superintendent of Parkland Hospital this morning said that no extra precautions were being taken, no extra security measures for Governor Connley at Parkland. He said, "We have no fear for the governor's life."
Pierce, we thank you for that report. We'll be back to you later during the day. Now we go back to Robert McCormick in Washington.
And I'm not going to pick up quite where I left off. I want to get back to Representative Boggs in just a moment and to Representative Ford. But in the meantime, we just heard that report from Dallas, and Senator John Tower is here in the studio with me right now. And I would like to ask him, if I could, without being presumptuous about these abusive telephone calls that we were just told from Dallas you got. Did that actually happen, Senator Tower?
Yes, my office did receive some abusive phone calls. Some of the commentators shortly after the event were speculating that this might have been a conservative or right-wing extremist who performed this terrible deed. And, of course, some people wrongly, I think, identify me with a radical right wing, with which I am not identified, let me hasten to say, and so we did get some highly abusive phone calls, and I felt it necessary to move my family out of my house. However, I don't think that there is any real danger, anything of that sort. I think now that the dust is cleared and we have a prime suspect that that sort of thing will not happen again.
They were so bad, Senator, that you felt you had to take your family out of your home?
Just a precautionary measure. I didn't really expect any trouble, but just as a precautionary measure, I thought I should do that.
Well, the calls must have been extremely abusive.
They were. Highly abusive.
And that was in Washington. Your family is here.
Yes, they are.
Were they local calls or long distance?
These were, I think, largely local. I haven't discussed the origin of them with my staff, but I think for the most part they were of local origin.
And they came into your office?
Yes, I was en route to St. Louis when this happened. I flew back last night, so my beleaguered staff had to demand the office in my absence yesterday afternoon.
Have you any idea how they handled such a thing? It must have been a tough thing for them to do.
Well, I think they handled it very well indeed. And as I say, I don't expect a recurrence of that now that we have a prime suspect, one that I just heard District Attorney Henry Wade of Dallas thought that the evidence was sufficiently conclusive that this man will be quickly indicted and tried.
Well, that's sort of a disturbing aspect of this that I'd not heard before. That I didn't know that that the emotion had manifested itself in any such way.
Well, I think it's understandable, and certainly I bear no malice toward anybody, because in a different circumstance I might conceivably reacted that way myself. I don't know. But as I say, I don't expect a recurrence of it. The American people are reasonable people, and even in outrage they can be calm.
Well, Representative Boggs, now to get back for just a moment, as the Speaker's assistant in the House, you were awfully close to him. Some of us were concerned yesterday about the Speaker, about how he'd take this. I didn't see him yesterday. Is the Speaker all right from what you said? I judge he is.
The Speaker's fine. He had a bad week, as you know, Bob. His brother died last Sunday, and he had just returned to Washington after the funeral of his brother, which was on Wednesday. But he looks well. He's shocked, just as all of us are. But I must say that I think he's in fine health, and as I said a moment ago, he's second in succession. I don't think he realizes that, because that in itself is an awesome responsibility.
I cannot imagine the Speaker moving around slowly enough so Secret Service men, with all due respect to the alacrity of our Secret Service men, so they can keep up with him.
Well, it's going to be interesting. He doesn't want him around.
Representative Ford, this is Representative Gerald Ford of Michigan. You have been quite a force in Republican politics in the House since the beginning of this session. What do you think the effect of this will have on the Republican organization in the House? It's something we haven't talked about at all yet.
Well, of course, Bob, we haven't, as a Republican leadership, sat down and analyzed the situation. As a matter of fact, I talked to Charlie Halleck yesterday afternoon, and it was the consensus among all of us that politics should be the last thing we should discuss at that very tragic hour. Inevitably, however, there will be a legislative program, as Congressman Boggs has indicated. It will then be the responsibility of the minority and the majority to work out what the program will be and what the opposition will do. I would say that the minority, the Republicans, will make a maximum effort, without any sacrificing of principles, to cooperate, to help and assist the new president and the Democratic leadership in the House and in the Senate. It's so difficult to be specific because nobody's had their mind or their thought on what the legislative schedule will be. As a matter of fact, I am rather sure, Hale, that we'll probably have a minimum of activity for, a week or thereabouts? It's hard to say.
That's what I wanted to ask all three of you gentlemen. As a matter of fact, this came as such a shock to all of you up there. Don't you really need a few moments to collect yourselves before you can buckle down to work again?
That would be my reaction, but there are certain things, one on Monday, that is absolutely essential to consider and approve. It's the continuing resolution for the appropriation bills that have not yet been enacted into law. This is something that must be done.
Well, we have to do it before the end of the month. We don't have to do it on Monday. And there were two things. Just an interesting footnote on announcing the program on Thursday. Charlie Halleck, the minority leader, asked me if I would ask that the House, when it adjourned on Friday night, that when we adjourned on Thursday, that we would adjourn and meet over till Monday, meaning this coming Monday, and then that I would also ask unanimous consent that when we adjourned on Wednesday nights, that we would not meet until the following Monday, which would have given us Thursday and Friday without any question. And I wouldn't do that, not because I didn't want to, but because we had two things pending. One was the temporary increase in the national debt ceiling, and the other, of course, was this continuing resolution. Well, on Thursday late, the Senate passed the debt ceiling, and I don't know whether President Kennedy signed that or not prior to his assassination. But I went to the Senate right before they voted on the debt ceiling, and I then said to Carl Albert that it looked as if when we met on Monday that we would be able to agree to go over to the following Monday on Wednesday, so no one would have to worry about a Thanksgiving recess. Now, obviously, as Jerry says, we must pass that continuing resolution. And, of course, we have outstanding appropriation bills that have not been passed, and they must be passed certainly before the end of this year.
Well, that's a beautiful illustration of something we've been trying to say here. The President and all the rest of you people have the, I'm sure, unhappy job of keeping the government going no matter what happens. And this continuing resolution you speak about, for the benefit of our listeners, would allow appropriations for the various government departments for whom specific bills have not yet been passed.
Correct.
Would allow their money to continue until specific legislation can be put through, and without that money they are out of business. Obviously we can't slam on the brakes of the government, and so there is work to be done. I suppose, Senator Tower, the same thing applies in the Senate, doesn't it?
Yes, of course I can't speak for the Senate leadership. I can't even speak for the minority leadership of the Senate, but we still have a job to do. I think the great characteristic of our American system is the order and stability and the continuity of it. It keeps going on, and we must, of course, be about the people's business, even in a time of great national tragedy.
Well, thank you very much, all three of you gentlemen. Senator Tower of Texas, Representative Boggs of Louisiana, and Representative Ford of Michigan. And now I've just been told that we should call in, if we can get him, Robert Goralski at the White House.
President Lyndon Johnson is now meeting with Secretary of State Dean Rusk in the Executive Office Building. The President, looking very somber-faced, has just stepped across to the Executive Office Building, across Executive Avenue, walking at a very brisk pace. He is expected to confer with Secretary of State Rusk for another 15 or 20 minutes, and then a new appointment has been added to his schedule. At 10:15, a little more than a half hour from now, he'll be meeting again with Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. One of his first meetings yesterday here at the White House as President of the United States was with the Defense Secretary. Can you hear me, Bob?
Yeah, I'm here.
That's the story here from the White House. Bob McCormick, can you hear me?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm having a little trouble with my buttons here. Yes, thanks very much, Robert. You people have just heard the rather astonishing news, to us at least astonishing, that Senator Tower of Texas received so many abusive telephone calls after this happened that as a precautionary measure, he moved his family out of his Washington home. We had not up to that time had any indication that the emotional response had vented itself in that special direction. Senator Tower said that the first reflex of a good many people seem to be to blame the assassination of President Kennedy on the radical right in Texas, which Senator Tower emphasized he does not represent nor belong to nor in any way sympathize with. But that's sort of a frightening thing when we think about it. Well, I think we have things rather up to date here for the moment, so I'm going back to... Oh, wait just a moment. I'm getting contrary signals.
Good morning, Carl Albert. Nice to see you. Nice to see you.
Representative Albert, the Democratic leader in the House, has just come into our studio now. We've been talking to some of your colleagues just a moment ago, Representative Albert. What is the situation in your side of Congress now as a result of this thing? Have you had any chance to assess it at all? Do you have any idea where you go from here or what you do?
Well, I would say it depends on what area we're talking about. As far as the personal loss, I don't think the members of the House of Representatives, many of whom, including myself, have served with the President, have ever been stunned as much as we were stunned by the untimely death of a man who was as much alive as any human being in the world, who was so fine, so lovable, who was so in love with humanity and with life, that he should be stricken down in such a tragic manner. From that angle, I can tell you that we are all sad, Republicans and Democrats alike, old and young. Now, from the standpoint of the legislative program, I think it will move on. I think that President Johnson, whom I know as well as I have known President Kennedy, is devoted. I think the Congress will move on with the program, and that in the end, the legislative results will be the same as they would have been had President Kennedy lived. Of course, this is a shock. It's a loss such as this country hasn't suffered in the way of an individual loss in generations. It came at such a time as to make it a worldwide tragedy. But legislative-wise, we will carry on.
Some of your people, Representative Albert, when I saw them yesterday, were in such a state of shock that I couldn't help but wonder whether we all know they must carry on, but how are they going to do it? Don't they need a breather to recover a little bit? I have just never seen your people so stunned. They were just walking around in dazes.
Well, they've never been so stunned. I've never personally been so stunned over a thing. When a tragedy strikes in your own family, unless it strikes by accident, you're usually at least partially prepared for the event. But here, it wasn't even an accident. It was a foul deed which struck down a man who gave forth more love and more of life than anybody that I have ever served around in my lifetime. It really shocked us. I was sitting down ready to eat my lunch yesterday when a secretary from the Committee on Agriculture ran over to me and said, "Did you hear that President Kennedy was just shot?" Well, I'd just started to eat, and I never ate another bite all day long. I couldn't eat. I just couldn't believe it, and I was hoping beyond hope that the wound would not be a mortal wound and that it would have been a bodily wound, perhaps. But when I found out that he had been shot in the head, I knew that we would never have him anymore. And I just couldn't believe it on the one side, and I could hardly stand it on the other side.
Well, the Speaker of the House, your boss, so to speak, now is the next in line for the presidency. Do you think that will make any difference in his functioning in the House? Will he have to sacrifice any of his sort of personal day-to-day leadership in the House as the next in line? Of course, he will be protected at all times by Secret Service people we know, which I think he'll find a little difficult to put up with, probably. But otherwise, do you think it will make any difference in his operations?
Well, I don't think that it will make a great deal of difference in the Speaker's operations. The Speaker has been a national congressman, if anybody in the House has ever been. He's voted national issues through the years. Time and again, for instance, I've seen him be the only congressman in either House, and this included the former president, vote for a farm bill on either side of the aisle, Republican or Democrat. He, if anybody has ever been a national congressman, is John McCormick. He's had national perspective ever since he's been in Congress.
This must have been a particularly severe shock to him, wasn't it?
It was a terrific shock. Immediately after I got word of this, and the Speaker had received word just after I did, I got a call from Claude Desautel at the White House that the president was dead and that he had official word that he was dead. And from Ted Sorensen called me, too. And they were trying to get the Speaker, so I went up to the Speaker's office. He was there alone, and I told him that Ted Sorensen wanted to talk to him, and I told him that it was official. He didn't know it at the time. Carl Vinson came in, and the three of us sat there. After he talked to Ted and got the word himself, for about a half hour without anybody else there with us. And there were the two most venerable men of the House that were there sitting talking about this matter, and me listening, stunned too. Very little was said, but you could see that these two men who have been here for 2 generations were shocked beyond words over the death of this young man whom they had helped to bring into prominence as a young freshman Congress when he came here, when I did, in 1947.
It's hard, of course, for most of us to realize how close members of Congress were to President Kennedy, because he did serve in both houses and was active, extremely active in both houses. And it is, as you mentioned a moment ago, it is just a loss within the family almost, isn't it?
I think President Kennedy was an extra member of every congressman's family. I don't know how he spread himself so wide. And I think he was almost an extra member of nearly everybody's family in the country. When they disagreed with him, they still loved him personally. And all the polls have indicated when he'd come to the tough issues and maybe they would be unpopular, his personal popularity was still high. People loved President Kennedy. Of course, they loved the office of president. And all Americans love the office, and they love all occupants. I think they had a special personal affection for John Kennedy. And another thing from a personal angle, few members of Congress really know all the members well. President Kennedy, I think, knew every member with whom he ever served in both houses of Congress, and what is more important, he never forgot them. For instance, 2 or 3 years ago at a fundraising banquet here, a congressman who left Congress about 6 or 7 years ago, Congressman Lyle of Texas, and I went in to the banquet together. Mr. Lyle hadn't seen the president or the president him since he'd left Congress. He came over to the table and said, "Hello, John." That shows what everybody thought he had, that he really had an interest in people.
Thank you very, very much, Representative Albert, and thanks a lot for coming down here at a time when I know it isn't very pleasant for you. And now next, we're going to get another report from the White House from Robert Goralski. Robert Goralski at the White House, are you there?
Robert, allow me to cut in. This is Russ Ward in New York. I might say that the expressions of grief and sorrow that have been voiced by your congressional guests this morning are being echoed around the country. Here in New York, for example, the city is having its own memorial to the President and a pontifical mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral that starts just a few minutes from now. And around the country, most of the major college football games that were scheduled for today have been postponed or canceled because of the death of the President. At the games that are being played, there will be halftime memorial services instead of the usual band displays. One of the first games to be called off was the scheduled visit of Harvard to Yale. The former president is an alumnus of Harvard. He once competed as a member of the varsity swimming team there. There's been some speculation that the traditional Army-Navy game at Philadelphia next Saturday may be canceled. An Army spokesman says there will be no decision on that until next week. From around the world, we continue to receive expressions of sorrow from all the major capitals. A report now from NBC's Alan Kennedy in New Delhi.
In India, President Kennedy's assassination evoked almost instantly the image of Lincoln, though there was no evidence in the news reports about the motive of the murder. It was enough for Indians with a smattering of history to know that a white man was reported to have gunned down a president who had stood strongly for Negro rights. President Radhakrishnan, without going into the question of motive, said President Kennedy, and I quote, died a martyr to the cause of human liberty, unquote. The 75-year-old Indian president, who visited the U.S. in June, was awakened at 2 a.m. to receive the terrible news. His aides said he closed his eyes for moments, praying for the dead president's soul, and then dictated condolence telegrams to Mrs. Kennedy and the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson. Prime Minister Nehru, who has not been in good health, was not immediately wakened. On doctor's orders, his staff refused to pass on the news to him immediately. His daughter, Indira Gandhi, finally broke the news. Nehru later, talking to correspondents, looking old and bowed with age and shock, told them that the consequences of Kennedy's death would be far-reaching. But he hoped that Kennedy's policies would be continued. Flags flew at half-mast here in an all-state capital. Americans received sympathetic expressions wherever they went. An Indian correspondent asked me, with hurt and bewilderment in his voice, "What has happened to your people?" This is Alan Kennedy of the Associated Press reporting for NBC News, New Delhi.
European radio and television stations, for the most part, played somber music between bulletins on the death of the president. The BBC, for a brief period last night, went back to its regular television schedule with a comedy program. It was immediately deluged with angry complaints, and it promptly went back to church music and tributes to Mr. Kennedy. Other reaction now as we hear from NBC's John Rich in Tokyo.
Japanese can't understand how such a thing could happen in the United States, which they view as a model of democracy. The assassination of the president has shocked Japanese and in a way smashed an image they had of our country. That theme runs through and through the Japanese reaction to the president's death. Officially, all Asian leaders, with the exception of those in Peking, have expressed deep sorrow at what has happened. On a personal basis, individual Japanese have sought out Americans to console them. The news has had an unimaginable impact on this country and has shaken Asia like nothing else since the last war. One Japanese girl approached an American, stammered, blurted out the words, "Kennedy dead," then she fled in tears. John Rich, NBC News, Tokyo.
The United Nations General Assembly adjourned its meeting yesterday after members stood in a minute of silent tribute to the late Mr. Kennedy. The flags of the 111-member UN were taken down outside the building, and the UN flag flew at half-staff. Cuba officially expressed its deep sorrow in a statement issued at UN headquarters by Cuba's ambassador to the United Nations, Carlos Lechuga. He said Cubans were saddened by the news, despite the, quote, existing antagonism between the U.S. government and the Cuban Revolution. In Havana, the news was announced without comment. A spokesman for the New York Stock Exchange indicated this morning that the exchange would remain closed Monday because of the president's funeral. He said other major exchanges would probably also remain closed. Trading was halted on the New York Exchange for 26 minutes yesterday afternoon, following the announcement of the shooting of the president. During that period, the loss of stocks totaled $11 billion in the biggest wave of selling since the market break of May 29th, 1962. Newspapers around the country are expressing the feelings of all of us. Some typical editorial comment comes from the Richmond Times-Dispatch, which said the assassination, coming as it does as the latest in a series of violent deaths of heads of state, is a disgrace to the United States and a blot on the good name of this country. The Indianapolis Star said, "We never believed that any American could stoop to the dirty job of murder of the president." The St. Louis Post-Dispatch said the assassination is a national tragedy of great proportions. What is wrong with the U.S. that it can provide the environment for such an act? From the Baltimore Sun, yesterday's first shock of horror gives way this morning to a depth of sorrow beyond expression. The Philadelphia Inquirer said John Fitzgerald Kennedy had so much to live for, so many fruitful and rewarding years to look forward to, and then cruelest of fates to be struck down at the hands of a hidden assassin. The Philadelphia Bulletin: "We pride ourselves that we are a people who have accepted the law of democracy, that we thrash out our differences through open discussion and accept the verdict of the ballot. But in our pride, we forget perhaps that there are those among us who do not accept this law." From the New York Times, all of us, from the country's highest leaders to the humblest citizen, all of us are still in a state of shock from this stunning blow that even now seems unreal in its grotesque horror.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We now pause 10 seconds for station identification.
Wlw-Radio and the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation join its listeners in an expression of deep sorrow on the death of our President.
This is Russ Ward in the NBC newsroom in New York with continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The body of the former president was taken to the White House for the last time during the early hours of this morning, the body to lie in repose throughout the day while close friends and high government officials are paying their respects. In Dallas, Texas, a 24-year-old man, Lee Harvey Oswald, is being held without bail, charged with murder in the president's assassination. And from all parts of the world, expressions of grief and sympathy at this tragedy that has struck the United States. Reaction from abroad now as we hear from Irving R. Levine, NBC News, Rome.
Russell? Yes, who's that speaking?
The high government official to President Kennedy's funeral will probably be reached this evening. Until a short while ago, such a decision could not be taken because there was no government. Now Aldo Moro, 47-year-old Christian Democratic Party leader, has announced after 12 days of negotiations that he has reached an agreement to form a coalition cabinet. If the agreement is ratified by the participating parties, the Moro government will include the left-wing Socialist Party, which is Marxist in outlook and neutralist in foreign policy. There are fears that socialist participation in the Italian government may weaken Italy's ties to NATO, and the death of President Kennedy, whose influence was strong in Italy, adds to those fears. Irving R. Levine, NBC News, Rome.
We thank Irving R. Levine for that report from Rome. And now for further developments from the nation's capital, we hear from Ed Newman in Washington.
2 minutes ago, the immediate family of President Kennedy was to be admitted to the East Room of the White House to view his body lying in repose. Robert Goralski of NBC News is at the White House. We call him in.
There's still no indication that the family has actually gone into the East Room of the White House. Newsmen are standing outside the North Portico. The Marine, Army, Navy, and Air Force Guard of Honor is standing by now. And on Pennsylvania Avenue, large numbers of people are gathering to get glimpses of the first family, the dignitaries, the diplomatic corps that will be filing in for the next 8 hours as President Kennedy's body lies in repose. There was a brief scuffle outside the White House a few moments ago. A man, not wearing a raincoat, without a hat, carried a sign that said, "I warned JFK, and God has cursed him." The police permitted him to carry his placard until about 3 or 4 minutes later when a large number of people started gathering around him. We could not tell if they were taunting him or what, but about a half dozen police then went over and escorted the man away. This has been the only incident outside the White House thus far. There are now about 100 to 150 people who are standing across Pennsylvania Avenue looking at the north side of the White House. The day is turning overcast. Rain is falling intermittently. A heavy wind has whipped up, and more leaves are falling on the White House lawn. It's a very grim day, adding only to the feeling, the sentiment which pervades every inch of this area around here. Robert Goralski, NBC News at the White House.
At this moment, Irving R. Levine, NBC News correspondent in Rome, is on the line in Rome. Irving, is it possible to say at this moment what the effect will be on the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, on NATO, of the death of President Kennedy and the accession of President Johnson?
Well, it's very difficult to say, Ed. There are, however, several factors which make it a very troublesome situation. Italy has been without a real government for more than 2 weeks now. Premier Aldo Moro, who has been trying to form a government, has today announced that he has obtained an agreement with 3 other parties, including the Socialist Party. The Socialist Party is left-leaning, it is Marxist, it is neutralist. It wants, at best, a passive attitude in the NATO alliance. Now, President Kennedy's influence in Italy was very great. If anyone could have kept Italy in the NATO alliance as a willingly participating member, it would have been President Kennedy. With his disappearance from the scene and with the emergence of the Socialist Party in a new government, it makes Italy's future role in NATO very worrisome indeed.
Now, will Prime Minister Moro come for the funeral, do you think, Irving, or is it impossible to say?
It's still early to say. Moro has only announced so far that he has reached an agreement with the other parties. That agreement must now be submitted to the governing committees of the 3 parties, so that Moro himself, one would think, would be very much tied up with the internal political situation here for the next few days, and would probably be unable to go himself.
It would be more logical for the President of Italy to come, would it not?
Yes, President Antonio Segni might be considered the more likely person, but in the absence of a government, under the Italian system, he is the only stable figurehead. He is, in a sense, the constitutional monarch, if one may stretch a term, and it would be unlikely that it would be considered wise for the president of the country to leave at a time when there is no government.
What you are saying is that the alliance was perhaps somewhat shaky before, and that it has suffered, so far as Italy is concerned, a very heavy blow with the death of Mr. Kennedy.
Very succinctly and well put, Ed.
Irving, what form is mourning for President Kennedy taking in Rome?
Taking a great many forms. One, newspaper headlines, big black streamers, all mourning the loss of President Kennedy. Conversations with Italians indicate how personally many of them feel his loss. He was extremely popular in Italy. A good short while ago, we're marching to the American embassy with Italian flags held in mourning, half-staff.
Irving, is there anything known in Italy about Mr. Johnson? Are there any opinions of him that you've heard? Or is he pretty much an unknown quantity so far as the Italians go?
President Johnson did visit Italy not very long ago. He spoke and with Italian leaders. However, not very much really was formed in the way of an opinion about him by the Italian leaders, and he made really no very great impression here. So there is, of course, a great deal of curiosity, a great deal of concern, a great desire to know what kind of a man and what kind of a government, what kind of a policy he will follow.
Irving, we know that Mrs. Kennedy was enormously popular in Italy. What has been the feeling about her in this last awful day?
Of course, tremendous sympathy, and I think that perhaps a message from Pope Paul to Mrs. Kennedy, which was sent today, reflects the feeling not only of the Pope, but of many Italians toward her, and expressing heartfelt sympathy and sharing with her the sadness of the moment.
Thank you very much, Irving. That was NBC's correspondent in Rome, Irving R. Levine. This is Edwin Newman in Washington, returning now to Russ Ward in New York.
Edwin, perhaps the most shocked of anyone at the death of the president, aside from his family, that is, was the Secret Service assigned to guard him during this, what was hoped to be a joyous trip to Texas. And for more than 2 weeks before the trip, Secret Service agents had been working quietly in the city of Dallas to prevent the very thing that did happen yesterday, the assassination of the president. They had inspected the site for the president's speech. They had carefully looked over the route of his motorcade, talked to individuals, and their habit.
Edwin Newman in Washington, returning now to Russ Ward in Russ Ward.
Edwin, perhaps the most shocked of anyone at the death of the president, aside from his family, that is, was the Secret Service assigned to guard him during this, what was hoped to be a joyous trip to Texas. And for more than 2 weeks before the trip, Secret Service agents had been working quietly in the city of Dallas to prevent the very thing that did happen yesterday, the assassination of the president. They had inspected the site for the president's speech. They had carefully looked over the route of his motorcade, talked to individuals whom they knew the president would come into contact with, even kept a log of all known troublemakers in the Dallas area so they could check their whereabouts and their habits. At first, the Secret Service even had vetoed the site of President Kennedy's speech, the Dallas trademarked, on the grounds that there were too many balconies from which a possible assassin might hide. They gave in on the site of the speech only after making sure that each one of the 14 entrances to the building would be covered, that all persons coming and going could be kept under constant surveillance. The Secret Service personnel supervised the selection of the menu that the president enjoyed while he was there. They overlooked the preparation of the food to make sure that the president received nothing different from that eaten by others. For example, there was no special steak prepared for the president on Thursday evening. It was picked from among thousands that were being prepared for dinner guests that night, picked at random. They made sure that all points along the route of the president's motorcade were carefully guarded, especially the points of underpass that the bubble-top limousine had to pass. All congested intersections and places where crowds would gather had an extra complement of police. They even enlisted 350 policemen from the Dallas force to be on hand the day of the assassination. Everything carefully covered, but of course impossible to watch each one of tens of thousands of windows which overlook the route of the motorcade, and from one of those windows, the assassin's bullet. We might read to you a letter received by Senator John Tower of Texas some months ago, written by Lee Harvey Oswald, the man being held in Dallas, charged with murder in connection with the assassination. Oswald at the time was in the Soviet Union, and he wrote to Senator Tower of Texas as follows. My name is Lee Harvey Oswald, 22, of Fort Worth, up until October of 1959, when I came to the Soviet Union for a residual document for non-Soviet persons living for a time in the USSR. The American Embassy in Moscow is familiar with my case. Since July 20th, 1960, I have unsuccessfully applied for a Soviet exit visa to leave this country. The Soviet refuses to permit me and my Soviet wife who applied at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow on July 8, 1960, for immigration status to the USA to leave the Soviet Union. I am a citizen of the United States of America, and I beseech you, Senator Tower, to raise the question of holding by the Soviet Union of a citizen of the U.S. against his will and expressed desires. And it's signed, yours very truly, Lee H. Oswald. The 24-year-old man, at the time he wrote the letter, he was 22, now 2 years later, being held in Dallas, Texas, charged with the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. We might add that Oswald protests his innocence, says he did not kill the president nor anyone else. We might also mention that Texas does have capital punishment in the form of electrocution on charges of first-degree murder. The 55-year-old new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, left his Spring Valley, Washington home at 8:45 this morning, traveled to the executive office building, his temporary suite there, just to the west of the White House, shortly after 9 o'clock, to begin his first full day in the presidency. It was less than 24 hours after he had taken the oath of office in the presidential airplane at Dallas, Texas. He first called in his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara for the first of many high-level meetings today. He drove to work in a limousine escorted by motorcycle policemen and 2 Secret Service cars. Among the first to be called in for counsel and support by the new president was former President Dwight Eisenhower, on whom the late Mr. Kennedy had consulted many times during periods of crisis. President Johnson set aside time following his meeting with Mr. Eisenhower for a few silent moments beside the body of the dead Chief of State, slain by the assassin's bullet in Dallas yesterday. Now for more from the capital city, we hear from Ron Nesson at National Airport in Washington.
Undersecretary of Navy Paul Fay, a close friend and wartime comrade of John Kennedy, has just arrived back in Washington from the West Coast. As a close friend, he said he could be expected to be more critical of the late president than some who knew him only from the distance. But he said John Kennedy was the only man he ever knew with true greatness. Fay said he remembers Mr. Kennedy as a man of zest and vigor who was close to the people. Fay said the late president believed in the living. And now at this time of his death, this feeling has been transmitted to the country, and the country will carry on. This is Ron Nesson, NBC News at National Airport in Washington.
From London, word just in, the Duke of Edinburgh will represent Queen Elizabeth at the memorial service for President Kennedy in Washington on Monday. This announced a short time ago from the British capital. Here in the city of New York, residents paying their own tribute to the late president in a pontifical mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral, now underway here. And the city's Negro leaders are mourning the passing of a man they're calling the second great emancipator. This was the phrase used by A. Philip Randolph, the president of the Sleeping Car Porters and one of the leaders of the civil rights movement in the United States. He compared the late Mr. Kennedy with President Lincoln, the great emancipator who was assassinated nearly 100 years ago. Executive Secretary Roy Wilkins of the NAACP said, "We have no doubts that the assassin was motivated by hatred of the president's ideals." Mr. Kennedy was to have delivered a speech in Dallas yesterday, a speech that was not delivered because of the tragedy that took his life. The speech ended with these words, "And the righteousness of our cause must always underlie our strength. For as was written long ago, except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain." The quotation from the Bible, Psalm 124. The complete verse reading, "Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain." The ailing 75-year-old father of the president has been told that his son is dead from an assassin's bullet. Mrs. Rose Kennedy, the president's mother, Senator Edward Kennedy, their son, and a daughter, Eunice Shriver, all were present at the time. A neurologist, Dr. Russell Bowles, Jr. of Boston, stood by as the sad word was given to the elder Mr. Kennedy. His reaction was not made public. Mr. Joseph P. Kennedy, whose life filled with both success and grief, advised of his son's death shortly after Mrs. Kennedy returned from St. Francis Xavier's Church, where she had attended 2 masses this morning. More on this tragic story now as we go back to Dallas and NBC's Tom Pettit.
Now, what is your speculation as to what the motive may have been?
I try not to speculate on any crime. I don't think it pays to speculate on a crime.
Is there any feeling among the Dallas police force that this might have been avoided?
None that I know of. As far as being avoided, certainly you might say that it could have been avoided had you had someone in every window and every building. But the feeling among the Dallas Police Department, as it is with every other citizen in the country, is one of deep grief and deep regret.
Thank you very much, Chief M.W. Stevenson, Deputy Chief of the Dallas Police Department. That is the picture at this hour at Dallas Police Headquarters. This is Tom Pettit, NBC News, in Dallas.
Later developments from Washington now as we go to NBC's Robert Goralski.
President Johnson has just begun a meeting with Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in the Executive Office Building directly across the street from the White House. Inside the East Room of the Executive Mansion, members of the presidential family, the Kennedy family, are now in there where the president's body lies in repose. This will continue for the next 45 minutes, at which time President Johnson will make the brief walk across West Executive Avenue and go into the East Room where he, too, will pay his respects to the late president. On Pennsylvania Avenue, traffic is clogged once again. Despite a heavy rain which started falling a few minutes ago, there are perhaps 200 or 300 people directly across the street standing under umbrellas, under newspapers, watching the White House, where nothing visibly is happening from the outside. Now, the traffic is blocking most of their views. I can see very, very little. As I look west on Pennsylvania Avenue, I can see that traffic from a east-west to east direction is blocked about 6 or 7 blocks. People, as they approach the White House, are slowing down. Traffic is 3 or 4 lanes wide. And people are moving very, very slowly, hoping to catch a glimpse of the White House. But all they can see is the Executive Mansion, where rain is falling in a generally dismal picture, and atop the Executive Mansion, the American flag at half-staff. Robert Goralski, NBC News at the White House.
This is Edwin Newman in the NBC newsroom in Washington. We are told that the casket in which the remains of President Kennedy lie is draped with an American flag, and it is lying on a catafalque, which is to say a platform that is draped in black. It has been said that that catafalque is the same one that held the casket in which lay the remains of Abraham Lincoln after he was assassinated. One of the noticeable and striking aspects of the events since the murder of President Kennedy has been the part played by his brother, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy. It is on Robert Kennedy that Mrs. Kennedy has most relied. He was at the airport last night when she came in. And he has, as far as we know, been with her almost continuously since. There will be we're just told, a press briefing, that is to say a meeting with the reporters at the White House by the White House News Secretary, Pierre Salinger, in about an hour and a half, an hour and 40 minutes from now. And we may at that time receive information as to the definite funeral plans for the president. What we do not know at this moment, it has not been specifically stated where the president is to be buried. The presumption is that it will be in the Kennedy family plot in Brookline, Massachusetts, but that has not been specifically announced. The body is to be taken tomorrow to the Capitol. It will be there for about 21 hours. Funeral services are to be held late on Monday morning at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington. And probably the president will be buried in the Kennedy family plot in Brookline, Massachusetts, but that has not been specifically announced. We are told that it was Attorney General Kennedy who was at the side of Mrs. Kennedy at the White House. Is Robert Goralski on this line? Can he hear me? Can Robert Goralski hear me?
Yes, I can, Ed. Go ahead.
Robert, do you know, has Mrs. Kennedy gone into the East Room?
I've been standing out here for the last half hour or so, Ed, and the only member of the Kennedy family that I've seen arrive here at the North Portico has been one of the children of Attorney General Robert Kennedy. That was about 15 minutes ago. I would imagine that most of the family came here quite early this morning, and they have been in the White House for quite some time, and went directly then to the East Room at 10 o'clock, at which time they saw the president's body lying in repose. The newsmen were admitted to the East Room a little after 9 o'clock, and there we saw the catafalque. The casket is draped in an American flag. At each corner, a member of the Armed Services, a member of the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force, standing at rigid attention. And while we were in there, there were two priests of the Roman Catholic Church who were praying on two portable kneeling arrangements that had been brought in late last night by two priests from St. Matthew's Cathedral. It will be at St. Matthew's that the president will be, that the Requiem Mass for the president will be said on Monday.
Bob, were you there when President Johnson arrived this morning?
Yes, he came in about 8:55 and immediately went to the White House, not to the Executive Office building, spent 35 minutes in the White House, then went back across Executive Avenue for a conference with Secretary of State Dean Rusk. Mr. Rusk, arrived very early this morning, I think about 1 o'clock. He was out of Hawaii en route to Tokyo when word was flashed to the aircraft carrying the Secretary and other members of the Cabinet. The plane immediately changed course, returned to Honolulu, refueled, and made a speedy dash back to Washington. This is the first opportunity that Mr. Rusk has had to see the new president.
I believe that Secretary of Defense McNamara is also to see Mr. Johnson. In fact, I think the appointment began 10 minutes ago.
That's right, Ed. They began their second meeting at 10:15 Eastern Standard Time. The first meeting that Mr. Johnson had yesterday when he returned to the White House from Dallas was with McGeorge Bundy and Secretary of Defense McNamara, and I imagine they reviewed matters of critical national defense and national security. And I imagine that's what they're discussing right now.
The president, when he arrived this morning, I believe, was accompanied by Representative Homer Thornberry of Texas.
That's right. Homer Thornberry is a Texas congressman, soon to be a federal judge. And along with Mr. Kennedy was Bill Moyers, the deputy director of the Peace Corps.
With Mr. Johnson.
With Mr. Johnson, I'm sorry. And
William Moyers, deputy director of the Peace Corps.
That's right. The only member of the late president's staff was his Army aide, General Clifton. General Clifton accompanied Mr. Johnson in his walks from the White House to the Executive Office building and back again. And I would imagine that, as is the case with all presidents, that an aide is in all the various meetings where national security matters, defense, and foreign policy matters are discussed. The three aides have been here at the White House since the presidential party returned from Dallas last night.
The director of the Central Intelligence Agency, John McCone, has also been at the White House this morning, I believe, and McGeorge Bundy, who is Special Assistant on National Security Affairs to the President.
That's right. They arrived shortly after the President got here from his Northwest Washington home. As is the case with the Director of Central Intelligence, his participation in meetings is never formally announced, but it was quite obvious that he was discussing with Mr. Johnson matters of security and defense.
It is, in a way, I should think, one of the more horrifying aspects of this, that Mr. Johnson must go on with affairs of state.
I would imagine that what Mr. McCone was discussing with Mr. Johnson was the usual morning intelligence briefing that the President receives wherever he is. In most cases, presidents receive such intelligence briefings from their military aides, who in turn get the information from the Central Intelligence Agency, the State Department, and the other agencies of government. And I imagine that this is what Mr. McCone did this morning, to give Mr. Johnson a first-hand account of what is happening in the world as of this morning.
I say it is almost horrifying to think that that is what Mr. Johnson must turn his mind to today, and yet in a way it's perhaps helpful to him that he can think about these things and not dwell on the awful events that have made him the President of the United States.
The turmoil of personal anguish, and yet being forced to absorb information which is vital to this country, and upon which he may have to make a very important decision any minute. That responsibility, that awesome responsibility, is on his shoulders, and I'm sure he's vividly aware of it.
Thank you very much, Bob. Now back to Russ Ward in New York.
We have just received word from Dallas that the gravely wounded Governor John Connley has been told by his wife that President Kennedy is dead.